in this last couple of years. Part of it was having to be hospitalized for a heart condition, and the other is having torn ligaments in my left foot, again, having to be on my back for a considerable length of time. And I've learned a lot about, as you age, there are new confrontations. I've become a widow, and I have remarried another widow. And our perspective is that the deaths of our spouses really forced both of us to look at being better partners. And that's required a lot of work for me to think about that. I had a long marriage, very successful marriage. But when I look back at it, I realized that I needed to, excuse me, I needed to look at myself, and I have thinking about it and working on it. I realized that it seems like as you age, one of the things that happens is there's grief. And one of the topics that was very interesting to me is the fact that I was listening to one of Oprah's interviews that she did of a guy I think most people will have heard of, Wayne Dwyer, and they were talking about alignment. When you're aligned and you have with your own energies, and there's no part of your life that is discrepant, is when you really can achieve your true creativity and the things that can get into ways when you are at odds with yourself. And I saw some areas of my life that I thought that I had not finished processing. And then I was handed a book by Michael Linden called Post-Traumatic Embitterment Disorder, which I'm going to talk about some this morning. But the concept of embitterment is really an important one, and I think overlooked. And Linden's work was really well executed, well documented, well researched, and it represents what's happening in all the fields. Is that whether it be addiction or trauma, there's so much growth that has occurred in the last 5 to 10 years. We are really redefining and rethinking through all processes. So post-traumatic stress disorder, which we're all familiar with, is actually getting kind of parsed up into 6 different sections. Depression is being similarly, is almost too global a designation and has parts to it. And we're starting to get more precise in our thinking. And as we do that, it changes. We start to think about addiction. What I propose to do this morning is I want to talk to you about embitterment, but I also want to talk to you what I think, and maybe this reflection would fit for you too. There are 2 characteristics, I think, of our country right now. And that I think that we are our #1 public health problem. And if you listen to the day, you're going to hear this from the speakers. You know the speakers, and I know they're going to tell you that this is a national crisis. Addiction is our #1 public health problem. And so the reality is what I've understood that post-traumatic stress disorder was a major contributor to it, but I hadn't thought about embitterment, at least in the way that Lyndon and Howard said. And I think that it's very important that we stop to think about it, because along with addiction being a problem in our country with bitterness. It seems to me that we are very conflicted and have a hard time coming to resolution around important issues, and that the conflict in our country has escalated compared to where it was, say, 20 years ago. And I'd like to talk about that as a somewhat related phenomenon. To do that, I first of all would like to go back to a painting, very famous in medicine, which is, a painting of Dr. Pinel during the French Revolution. And what the painting is about is he's going into the insane asylum and freeing and unchaining the inmates. The idea being is that they are citizens too, and the fact that they have a mental health problem, they needed to be treated with the same dignity and respect that medicine would do to all other patients. And so in mental health, it marks kind of a watershed of having respect and not being judgmental about mental health issues. However, this is a painting, a fairly contemporary painting, done in England in the early 19th century. And it was common practice in the English courts to, on Sunday afternoon, go to the insane asylums to look at the inmates for amusement. In other words, look how funny they are, look how weird they are, how strange they are. And it was kind of a way to see yourself as superior and different and better than people who had mental health problems. So those two kind of strains have been around for a long time. Now I'd like to challenge you to think about something, which is if you stop in the grocery store, you may find yourself literally, I mean, I know it's happened to me, where you come up to the cash register and you see the Inquirer and some of the other rags that are there, and you pause to read them because you don't really want to see people buy it. You want people to see you buy them. The reality is that they are, this is what our culture looks at when you think of all the people that have come into trouble with mental health issues. This piece by the Times of people who have politicians and some of our greatest leaders who gotten into sexual trouble. And the fact is, it's sports figures, it's actors, it's politicians. The fact of the matter is that there's an attitude towards the wealthy, successful person that why can't they get their act together? Why she's been through treatment 5 times and there's been no, and keeps having to go back. That means treatment doesn't work. Other than the treatment doesn't work, what happens is that within the business, she has handlers and recommendations are made, and the handlers say to this person, and kind of hits at their heart, these psychologists and people who've helped you in treatment are very nice people, but they don't know business realities. If you don't go on tour this summer, somebody else will, and you will be a has-been. And that's the biggest fear for some of them. And what it does is it puts them right back in the environment that they were there before. So, but it's what I'm suggesting to you is we're looking at people who are successful in our culture and as crazy people, and for whom there's no help. And what it does is it raises the issue of that mental health doesn't work. There was quite a storm let loose by the experience of when the whole issue of abuse within the media industry and the Me Too movement started. And the Me Too movement kind of spread out throughout the culture. And it wasn't just in the media, it was in business, it was in sports, it was in the Olympics, it was in college sports, it's in churches, it's at Catholic Church, struggling with huge issues in terms of its exposure right now. The First Nation people in Canada are coping just like the Native Americans are coping with discoveries that are coming out in the last 4 or 5 months. It seems that that throughout the sexual exploitation part of this thing has become of real interest to the public. And it is even in the professional community. This is an example from Johns Hopkins Hospital, where you had a gynecologist who had over 8,000 pictures of pelvic exams that he had been collecting, and they ended up paying $190 million in the ensuing results of it. So the scandals are everywhere. So the question is how does this happen? And having seen many folks who come out of this environment, one of the things that I want to say that I have come to the conclusion of, people who would entrap women in their offices, does that necessarily make them a sex addict? Well, it means that they have a problem, but not necessarily that it's sex addiction. I often get asked what I do for a living. The other day, this woman asked, and she says, "Oh, what you do is you work with pedophiles, or you work with people who do assault." And I said, "No, actually, the truth is that sex addiction is everywhere, like the other addictions are. And that what the real problem is, it can be your 8, 9, 10-year-old. It can be the 6 million adolescents who are struggling with porn. And we'll talk more about that, but it can be your pastor, it can be and a lot of people can be struggling with sex addiction without necessarily being into exploitation. But what I know is true about these people is that one of the commonalities that they have is embitterment. There's sort of a profile of coming from poverty and having their family shamed and taking very personally some events that happened, and to a lot of people, but they took it so personally. They made a decision that they were going to be wealthy and powerful. And that embitterment brought them to a level of entitlement that is not just in the business community, but throughout. So what I'm trying to make a point here is that if all these public figures were considered as canaries in the cage, what does it tell you? And sometimes it makes for some very interesting situation. This is a story of an executive who was a very high key executive in a Google corporation. He went to a website called Sugar Baby and hooked up with this woman and invited her out on his yacht. And they had wine. And what she didn't know is that a guy from Google is going to have cameras all over the place. And so she ended up poisoning him and murdering him, and was drinking her wine and stepping over the body, and it was all caught on film. And then I heard, and in her trial, one of the things that came out is that she was a fan of Dexter. Now, if you know the story of Dexter, which is a series of novels and was also a TV series, Dexter grew up to be a serial killer. His parents were killed when he was young. He was raised by a law enforcement officer who saw the tendencies and taught him that if he's going to kill people, he needs to kill the people that law enforcement misses. In other words, the people who are dangerous to society. So he was seen as kind of a good person, but also a very dark person. And there's some very dark humor to this whole thing because he's on a task force looking for himself, and has some pretty funny moments in it, actually. But the point is, she was a Dexter fan. And when I heard that, I said to my colleagues, there's going to be other people that she has murdered and felt that they were doing evil things, and she was taking them out. Turns out she has now 34 murders attributed to her. So the violence that we have in this planet and these stories are laced with anger, rage, humiliation, getting back, revenge, what have you. Now, we're going to return to perspective for a minute. Nasser Gaimi's book about what we call the first-rate madness, he talks about the fact that our greatest, and we'll come back to this over and over again, our greatest, most creative people often have mental health issues. And Abraham Lincoln was bipolar. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Edison, our scientists, our politicians, that actually that the struggle with mental health and the perseverance in meeting that struggle brings people to a level of performance that have been some of the greatest contributors to our culture and to our civilization. And that mental health is really one of the most important things that we can be doing. And as opposed to belittling or judging it, we should be looking at what's going on behind it and seeing what we can learn about this. I want to point out another thing from a cultural point of view. In 1930, Germany was a embittered nation. They lost World War I, but they felt like they never really lost the battle. They feel like they were sold out. They were in desperate times in 1930, and addiction was rampant within Berlin. The Germans were great chemists, and they invented a drug called Pervitin. Pervitin was basically crystal meth. And it was sold in the drugstore. You didn't need a prescription or what have you. You just picked it up like you would pick up a vitamin or aspirin or what have you. And what Pervitin does, as crystal meth does, is if you're depressed, which most Germans were, it immediately took that away. And secondly, is it gave you such stimulation that you felt very, your abilities were enhanced. You could go without sleep. Your memory was better. But it also was burning through your brain and your abilities. But what it did is by 1936, Hitler and the Nazi elite were using Pervitin and cocaine. And by 1939, most Germans actually were using Pervitin routinely. 600,000 at the beginning of the war, 600,000 packages of crystal meth were distributed to every week to all military. And so the Blitzkrieg really was crystal meth driven. And why that becomes important is that, I mean, Rommel, when he was charging to the sea and they overwhelmed the British and French troops, who outnumbered the Germans 3-1 and had better equipment, Rommel was asked to stop by Hitler. He wanted the troops to catch up, and Rommel wouldn't listen to him because he was high as a kite. And so it just marched all the way to the sea, and that's how they literally took over France. And the point I'm making about this is that withdrawal and the medicine did not really see the implications of crystal meth till about 1941, 1942. And by that time, they were building factories for making crystal meth, and almost everybody was using it. The reason I bring it up is that what it meant is that you could live next to a concentration camp. The other thing that crystal meth does to the brain, besides bring you to a point that if you stop using it, you go into this very painful withdrawal and death, is that you could live next to a concentration camp and be unmoved because Pervitin literally would destroy the capacity to be empathetic. And my concern about this is that as a culture, the classic measures of empathy have shown a steady decline of empathy in general population for the last 20 years. And I believe that the amount of addiction that we have in our culture, if you look across all the kinds of addictions that are available to us and what's happening with our youth right now, that we have a huge problem. that's literally going to break the back of the medical system. Because if you add obesity and compulsive overeating and the chemicals together, including nicotine, and you add into that sex addiction, the costs just in chemicals, alcohol and drugs alone is literally for the medical system $550 billion a year. The compulsive overeating, and you think of diabetes and you think of cardiac issues and what have you. I mean, it's staggering that 30% of our population are obese. 30% of our grade schoolers are obese. And the fact is that we live in a culture of abundance and we have not coped well with it. And so the fact of our matter is that we have this huge general problem. Now, one of the things that we also know is that, that it really is a problem of the brain. And one of the things that we talk about is that, I mean, there's a lot of things that affect addiction. There's 10 different portals that are documented. And one of them is to see the presence of dopamine. You see a normal person with the red in the midbrain. And then you compare that to a cocaine, obese, and alcoholic. You can see that one of the lacks is the dopamine. And so the inability to feel good about it is problematic. And so dopamine flow is an issue. And one of the things that is very clear, what they call dopamine insufficiency syndrome, is that what's one of the building blocks of addiction. And what happens is that there's different ways that that the brain becomes addicted. But what it does to the brain, and let's take porn as an example. What happens in porn is that 4 hours of porn or more a week, literally in studies of fMRIs, that the brain actually starts to restructure itself because the reward center becomes so important that it starts to cannibalize from other parts of the brain. So gray matter starts to diminish. The bottom of the brain that contains this, what's called striatum, and it has memory and feelings and the ability to make choices, the ability to make oxytocin, which is the chemical that creates in the frontal lobes good judgment about the next decision. All those things become compromised. And in addiction, we use the word salience. In other words, that reward system is so emphasized that it can take the frontal lobes and make a very bad idea look good. This is an example of a sex addict, and you can see that there's these holes, parts of the brain in significant places that just aren't active. And it's because of that interior deterioration of the brain. And it's helpful, if we find, to show patients a brain scan because the spouses start to see it less as a moral issue. And they say, hey, there's a real physical problem. And if they follow recovery, you can see the same person 2 years later, in which a lot of the things that go on in the brain can be reclaimed. And it's about focusing and helping the brain. All the neurons are replaced in 2 years, and the fact is that you can enhance and even bring. The literature shows where the brain would be much superior to what it was pre-recovery. There is a limitation. One of the limitations is the genetics of it. The fact is you still have the genes, and you can get lots better, but the fact of the matter is the genes have some limiting factor to how far better you can get because you have this predisposition, if you will, to addiction. So the fact of the matter is that you have a larger hill to climb, and about 25% of addiction is counted as genetic. I was a Fulbright scholar last year, and we've been looking at the DNA of brain of sex addicts, and clearly the dopamine insufficiency is there. We're about to release some papers about that, And what was very interesting is that we also found in the study, we did a comparison control group with 500 sex addicts from 8 hospitals in the US with a student population of 2,500 students. What we found is that about 12% of the students also had sex addiction as a problem. And then when we took the DNA of the students and the DNA of the patients that were coming from the hospitals, there were no differences in some of the structure of their DNA. Also, one of the things that we found, one of the things that goes with dopamine insufficiency is that there's a greater presence of attention deficit disorder. And so, so you are, if you are a sex addict, you are twice as likely to have ADHD. And if you have ADHD, you're 2.5 times more likely to be a sex addict. And so the fact of the matter is, we see what happens in the brain. This is an example of the different kinds of parts of the brain that get involved. Articles have appeared in many different of our journals. The Journal of Addiction Medicine, the journal, I did an article on the diagnostic criteria. If you look, people have been cataloging this for a long time, and for a lot of consistency of people finding the same things. One of the things that's happened in sex addiction is that ASAM, the American Society of Addiction Medicine, looked at sex addiction as an addiction in 2011 when they were surveying, and there was a very famous article in 2008 by a man named Reddish, in which 94 pages of meta review, and there just was no doubt from a brain chemistry point of view that it didn't have to be a chemical to be an addiction, and sex was included in that. Now that's starting to show up in the diagnostic manuals. This is the IDCD-11, and sexual compulsivity is proposed to be in that. And what they did is they put it under impulse disorders, which is the same thing they did with gambling. And the suspicion is that what will happen is that then they moved it over to addiction, which is kind of what we think will happen with sex. That brings us to the post-traumatic embitterment disorder thing. This is Linden's classic text about the definition and the evidence and what have you. There are lots of articles about all the changes that are occurring in looking at the part of trauma. But the idea that there is within that post-traumatic stress disorder is very much about anxiety and fear. Fear is the chief chemist of the brain, and it forces chemicals into the brain that are highly stimulating. And what it means is, like with children, for example, who are abused, that one of the things that happens is that they, if you take those abused children and put them with loving, kind parents, those children will do everything they can to get the new parents to treat them badly. And it's because the intensity, the excitement, that stress, those stress hormones we manufacture them ourselves, and that there is a very famous paper in 1988 in which Bessel van der Kolk was one of my colleagues at the Meadows. I think probably one of the most important papers of the 20th century, in which he talked about addiction to the trauma, and a trauma repetition, that you kept going back and doing the same thing over and over again. The way that we have looked at it in treatment is what I call the grievance story. And what I tell my patients, if it's the Middle French word for grievance is really the same word that is used to grip. You're holding on to it. If you think of the Grinch Who Stole Christmas, for example, as a perfect grievance story. He felt maltreated, he nursed the grudge, and his way to respond was to make everybody else miserable. And the grievance story is where wrong has been done. And it's not about anxiety. It's about feeling humiliated and enraged. And it's one of the drivers, if we start looking that there was trauma, but it may have be about anxiety, but it may also be about the humiliation and the feeling of being treated unfairly. So, and whole cultures can be affected by embitterment as well. For example, one of the examples that is often used is when East and West Germany were reunited. And East Germans who were political leaders, scientists, educated people, worked hard to get what they do, and they could only get menial jobs. There was embitterment about the fact that the West Germans would not allow them to return to their teaching posts or to be in governmental positions. And it illustrates how a whole culture can be embittered in that sense. One of the things that I wanted to show you was that this is one of the things that is, when I talked about taking depression and kind of parsing it out, that one of the things, as you'll see, there's various categories of sexual behavior across the top. And this is from the MMPI-RF. And there's a line right here, if you slice depression up, one of the things that they took as a slice they called demoralization. And if you can look across about the second line there, you'll see almost every sexual category has demoralization. And what that demoralization is about the fact that you want something that you know is bad for you. And it's hopelessness. Feeling hopeless, they feel trapped. And one of the keys to this in treatment is to get them out of that grievance story. So that means we have to go back and see, how do they make meaning out of things? And we've been making meaning out of things, so a lot of things. Like there was a time when in human development, when scalping, how many scalps you've taken, was in a tribal or a way the status of a family and what have you was that. But the human brain is always looking for some kind of way of measuring that I'm a success. You remember Scrooge McDuck, and I don't think that that's an analogy that a lot of us wouldn't have seen in people, where money becomes the index by which success is measured. And in fact, one of the things that was done at Stanford was a series of studies of people who do what is actually a form of gambling and financial high risk taking, that it activates the same parts of the brain that gambling addiction does. And I love this cartoon. It just struck me. He's snorting zeros and ones. I think that digitally, what's happening is that the internet and digitalization of things can also be highly addictive. And that brings us to the problem of children. In kids, one of the things that we know, and I've experienced this with my own children, is the reality is that I had an iPhone and I had a grandson who was 4 years old. He says, "Grandpa, give me your phone," and I give it to him, and he fixes it right away. And he's better at it than I am. And so the fact of the matter is that our children are digitally, their brains are evolving differently in a single generation. It's possible that we may see evolutionary change because of the digital stimulation of the brain in one single generation. Now, part of what happens in gaming, and gaming is going to be in the DSM in the addiction section, and the problem with it is that the brain also learns from gaming. And the rules of gaming is to be at the top, the best, and look for the greatest novelty, the next game, what have you. It's all about that measurement of success. And it gets geared up then not to be relational. And if that kid becomes applies that then to sexuality and gets exposed to sexuality on the internet, if the same rules are applied, and that becomes problematic. And so one of the things that Ed Wilson's talking about us as a planet, and he says, you know, when we evolved during a time where we were well fitted to our environment. However, technology has changed things so fast that our bodies don't respond to as to all the stimulation we're getting. We're talking about the supernormal stimulus, that porn or the sexuality that's available on the internet. So the problem is that it's, and I can say as a person who has been married, widowed, married, the fact is doing a good job in a relationship is a full-time activity. And on the internet, you can be courting 5, 6 people. You can look at 50 women at a time. I mean, it's like the reality is all of those things are true. So our kids are living in a world in which part of the story, and these are books that are kind of cultural icons already, Ready Player One and The Armada Story by Ernest Cline, and the whole thing about the unreal world of living in a world that is digitalized and is not reality based. And the movie Ender's Game, if you get to see that, is a good example of that kind of experience. And what our children are becoming is they're becoming the new warriors. And the next battle is going to be done digital. It's going to be digital. It's going to be by young people who can really master the kinds of level technical competence to be able to do it. We know that about 2/3 of our kids at the ages of 12, 13 are involved sexually on the internet. We know that they go into the altered universe, and we know that sometimes it's traumatizing to them, and it has all kinds of side effects, most notably that not only its impact on the brain, but also creating erectile dysfunction in young men, and that the brain actually changes and it makes it into where it becomes a consuming passion, and it becomes a gateway to lots of other things. One of the things that we did done in our research is we've been using what we call higher order scales. If you're familiar with psychological instruments, you know that there are kind of meta scales that look across all kinds of personality issues and reorganize how you could look at it. So in sexuality, for example, the issue is that like a score for exhibitionism would be like one mountain, because there's lots of ways to exhibit yourself. However, higher order scales is like a mountain range. And what we found is that that there's 7 kinds of types of those mountain ranges. One is sexualized attachment and trauma bonding. Trauma bonding is where you actually move closer to somebody who is harming you. And I wrote a book on this called The Betrayal Bond. And the characteristics of it is, and I can speak to it personally because I had a relationship with a person I just could not leave, and it was very hurtful. And the result of it was that I finally had to be in a place where I just couldn't even have contact with her. My advisor made it akin to Lucy in the football and Peanuts. If you remember, Charlie Brown would take a run at the football. And my advisor, when I was in graduate school, said, there's a cure for this, and it's called no more football. And the traumatic bonding is rife throughout this whole process. It happens where sex addicts fall in love with their prostitutes. We see it in the culture in varieties of different ways. in domestic violence, staying with somebody 30 after being hit 35 times before, involving anybody in the problem, um, keeping secrets in a corporation, um, and oftentimes feeling you're the only one who knows or you're a special one. It's a that you have get acknowledged for being special. So sexualized attachment is one of the ways that trauma bonding can appear. It can appear in when there's exploitation of the vulnerable, and the people, trauma bonding can go both ways in that. Isolated self-stimulation is where they go into the other universe. And one of the real surprises for me in this whole thing in this past year was to realize the density of collateral psychopathology is most dense in this particular category, because it's attract all different types of personality disorders and mental health dysfunctions that because it's another universe. You can do that. So people talk about porn light and that porn isn't that serious. What you're going to find is that porn is one of the hardest things to treat. And if they're really into porn addiction, it's going to be much more complicated than you would expect. The S&M community, the humiliation, degradation parts, the repetition of those are obvious. Swinging in public, anonymous sex, there's less of the psychopathology that's still there. Networking and the drug and sex trade, a lot of trading that goes on. It's probably about 23%, and there's not a lot of psychopathology in that particular amount range. But the point is, we're seeing these broader things that are occurring, and so we kind of line up the psychopathology constructs and the sexual dependency inventory scales that certified sex addiction therapists use to do assessments. This brings us to another issue, which is this book was appeared in 1954, and it's a book, it's the first romance novel. Story is innocent young woman falls in love with bad boy, and the whole thing is about her desire to reform him into being a good person and make up his deficits if she just loves him well enough, and he will choose her. That story, by the way, it's still a bestseller. Twilight is basically that story of, I had a granddaughter who, when she was 16, she started reading Twilight. I went to the first Twilight movie, and I realized that I was one of 5 men in the whole theater. And when Jacob, who is this 17-year-old werewolf coming out, takes off his shirt, women started screaming, and there's all this. And my granddaughter said to me, "Grandpa, you're actually watching the movie." And I'm going, yeah. And what I said to myself, here you got where the love objects of the girl is a 150-year-old vampire and a adolescent werewolf are the two choices she's got. And that story, reason I talk about it is you need to know that the story is very common. It was repeated in 50 Shades of Grey. It's the same story. And Twilight sold more books than any other book in history. And so the idea of the vulnerable person and the powerful president of a company, it's a story that is and has bad traits, is very common in our culture. So the other part I want to point out to you is that I'm very concerned because in this planet right now, we have more refugees in this planet than we had in World War II. And one of the people who wrote an interesting book about the level of fear, both in embitterment and in anxiety that is in war, is very captivating. And he talks, war is a force that gives us meaning, and he talks about the addiction of it. And he talks about how, as a journalist, how it was hard not to cover it, how the people that he met who were in war had a hard time leaving it. And I think of the violence of our culture at this point in time. Another example of it is in many of the public foundations that have to cope with the fact that people who go into emergency situations often take advantage of the populations that they go and utilize them sexually. This whole side of the world is something we need to understand better. How do we get out of it? Well, one of the things is we know there's stages that all addicts go through to do the repair work in the brain. That first you got to know there's a problem, and there's a shock stage, and there's a grief stage, and a repair stage, and a growth stage. We use the whole concept because the brain changes when it feels safe and when it has a story, and the rewriting of the story and the rewriting of the narrative. We use the heroic journey stuff, the Joseph Campbell stories like Star Wars and what have you, as ways of looking and understanding it. And that heroic journey then it puts a different cast on it. It's about courage. And so we tie these to the different stage of becoming a hero, and reframing what it is that they've been doing. Nancy Duarte in her book Resonate, which I highly recommend to everybody, is the best book on public speaking I've ever read. She did a model in which all the stages, and that basically there's takes the Star Wars story, evil empire, and Luke Skywalker is resistant to getting involved, wants to stay on Tatooine. And then he meets Obi-Wan Kenobi, and then the disaster strikes, and he's put into an extraordinary world. And in the extraordinary world, he has to develop new tools. He has to see himself differently. He needs to see his dark side, the famous scene in the dark cave. And he tests out the new skills, and then he returns to the ordinary world. So there's this special world with tools and language and ways of coping that are different, and that they have to go back into that. And we reframe that as a recovery story, as basically that's what happens in recovery. The resistance to go into recovery, sooner or later somebody gets to them, they get into the special world, they develop the skills, they deal with the traumas, whether it be embittered mental loss, the grief that goes with all the things that happened. There is a major portion of this. And one of the things that we see is that there are certain things that have to happen in order for therapy to work. Is first of all, you have to, start fixing the body on toxins, food, sugar, chemical stimulation. When I get patients, they are so revved up that it takes them almost a week. In fact, the first 2 or 3 days, you go through this process where they say, well, I didn't know that. And then you present them with a paper that was explained to them the day before, and they signed it. And you can see the look at their face that they realize how their brain is racing. Then the deal is at that point, you start getting them into the process of thinking about their life differently, and you stimulate them with new ideas, ways to think about it. And then you give them the tools to modulate and learning how to regulate their reactions. And there is also a very important phase of taking. I often encourage people to take time off or to figure out some way to give their brain a chance to consolidate all of their learnings. And then finally, there's an ongoing process of neurodifferentiation and learning where you start connecting all the dots, rewriting the stories and living your life differently and deliberately and intentionally. And you take those and you add those to what we know that addicts go through. And it pretty much is the stages that we see and the things we have to do at each one. Goleman's book, a guy who wrote Emotional Intelligence, his book on focus is really helpful. He helps us with the concept of there are 3 different kinds of focus. There's the rational focus, getting straight A's and going through medical school, bing, 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 bing. And there's also the emotional knowing where your part of your brain is in your heart. But there's a third, what he calls the wandering mind. The wandering mind are those people who are kind of drifting around and seeing things, but the species needed those people. They were the first warners. They were the first people to see possibilities. And what we have done is we have often see this is ADHD, when in fact it can be a very, very helpful thing. But if you got a wandering mind and you get into porn, and then you're not going to class, you're not getting your papers done at the age of 11, you get a diagnosis of ADHD, you get Adderall as a stimulant, porn and Adderall together really kicks things down the trail towards their drug addiction. In Recovery Zone, which is a book for the long term. I mean, it's not about getting sober, it's about staying sober. And that analysis of the grievance story parses and deconstructs the grievance story so that the embitterment part can be dealt with and the grieving can be dealt with. The goal is to get them into a place where they are at their excellence, their most best. Person who really did a great job of talking to addiction medicine about the fact you will not get sobriety if you do not have also the talent in mind. In other words, they got to see how bad things are now, and they have to see what it is that they're going for. And you start teaching them the resilience skill. An example of that is gratitude, really learning how to work with gratitude and get into this zone where things, I heard this phrase the other day by Reese Witherspoon. She says, when you're in that zone, it's kind of like things hum. And and that's a lifetime task to get people to that point where they have an inner observer that watches what Buddha calls the monkey business of the brain, is to be able to keep the focus. These are the wandering minds who be aware of what is important and use their ability and passion to be able to stick to the things that are important, and they are able to execute. When I was in Canada as a Fulbright scholar, one of the things we saw is that they spent over $150 million bringing the greatest experts in trauma and addiction that in the world knew. And they did a survey of what the public thought, what the experts thought about trauma, the brain problems, what have you. What the average citizen thought was it was poor character, poor judgment, poor parents, whatever. And they were worlds apart. Then they made films, and through every TV outlet, they started educating the public over 2 years and really got them to understand that sex addiction, compulsive working, what have you, that an addictive culture can be a destructive culture. And what they did then is they retested and found that they had shifted this understanding. And when they asked the average Albertan what was really the most important thing that they had to do, sex was what services did they need most? Sex, cocaine, work, eating, shopping, all of those things were listed as needing more services. And I think what's important is therapy is characterized as not useful, not effective. And sometimes I think we don't do a very good job of really, as mental health workers, to help people see the benefits of therapy lifelong. I've been in therapy, still am in therapy. I can't imagine not having that, because to have that, raising the brain to where it is a much more effective organ than it was before, is literally what I think it is about. But one of the things that Wilson said, Anthropocene, far distant geologists might say, unfortunately married swift technological progress with the worst of human nature. What a terrible a time was for people and for the rest of life. I think we need to change that. And the way that I think about that is, and I just screwed this up here, is to connect the dots and to see that there's a possibility that our country can again be compassionate, can start working together differently if we start working with the addictive side of things. Our sexuality can improve. We can do it different. Right out of Lord of the Rings, when the Prince of the Dwarves died and the Elven Princess asked, why did it hurt so much? It was because it's real. We need to get back to being real. I want to thank the people at the Meadows Foundation for Addiction Research and ITAP and the University of Alberta for making this possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carnes. Really appreciate that amazing presentation. We really, really thank you very much for joining us.
You're very welcome.
All right. Thank you so much. We'll see you later. All right. So thank you so much. We are going to sign out from Dr. Carnes. And I am going to also send you all the link to fill out a form, which will then be submitted to Addiction Hope, and that will prove that you were here, you sat down and listened, and can apply for your CE, and we will follow up with you and make sure that you get your CE accreditation. So give me just one moment here, and I'm going to Dr. Carnes there. Okay, perfect. All right, so if you look at your chat box there, where I have, I talked to you right at the beginning of the conference there saying hello, everyone. I just copied and pasted the link. It's a Google form, so please go ahead and fill that out. And that's gonna stay up there, so feel free to copy paste that, and so you can get your CE accreditation. Sound great? Good stuff. All right, so we are going to be moving on to our next presentation, which actually we have pre-recorded. So I am going to share my screen and make sure that we can play that video for you. So just one moment. All righty, so everyone, I'm going to share my screen. And we are going to go live with our second presentation. So see you in about an hour. Here we go. Of course, for those who don't know you and the battles that you've been through and how you have triumphed, can you talk a little bit about your story all the way back to the beginning to how, because no one chooses an addiction, these things are so complicated and complex, but how did this struggle begin for you?
For me, we have to go all the way back to my childhood. As is so often the case, we talk about where we are, but we don't talk about how we got there and all the environmental factors that went into it, because there is a difference between cause and correlation, right? We have all these things, childhood, into addiction and eating disorders. I was the middle of 3 children. People know my older brother, Mark, or may not, Shark Tank and the Mavs. I have a younger brother, Jeff. Mark, as you might guess, Mark was the firstborn. As you might guess, he was very outgoing and very entrepreneurial, selling this door to door and selling that door to door. You kind of knew what he was going to be even in his teens, and he became that and a little bit more. My younger brother, Jeff, the last born was the younger brother, last born, yes, was a jock, nationally ranked wrestler, beer parties, prom, and all the things I kind of wanted and I associated with love and acceptance. But unfortunately, I was classic middle child syndrome. I was shy, I was withdrawn, and I internalized anything negative said about me and to me and wore it like a skin-tight suit as who I was. And unfortunately, I also had a very difficult relationship with my mom. And I'm going to talk about this, but I want to make it clear to everyone listening today or watching today, I do not blame my mother for the things I went through. There is a difference between cause and correlation, but the home environment and trauma in childhood does correlate with a lot of things that go on in adult life. So it's important to talk about that. My mom and I there was a lot of fat shaming in my family. My mom would come home from selling real estate. This was back in the 70s, and I would be eating Chef Boyardee ravioli out of the can. I used to love Chef Boyardee ravioli. And she would see me doing this. She would say, Brian, if you keep eating that way, as my mom's mother, my grandmother said to her. And these were the things my great-grandmother said to my grandmother. Fat shaming in families is often handed down generationally. I do not blame my mother for that. These were the tools she was given as a young mother in the 70s. And so, as you might imagine, as someone who didn't understand the psychology of these things, didn't understand cause and correlation, I was just a teenager. I grew depressed at hearing these things because there was nothing I valued more in life than love and acceptance. And I believed that my mother didn't love me. And she did love me intensely. She did love me. She was just repeating cycles. I began to eat more Chef Boyardee ravioli and more, and I became a bigger Brian and a bigger Brian. And it so often happens when kids start to change for what other kids perceive in the negative in school. As I became heavier and my stomach started to grow outward, the bullying started, the fat shaming. Or a fat pig, well, these kids talk to my mom, right? And it all culminated one day when I was walking home with these kids who I perceived as the popular kids. They were the kids going to the beer parties, the kids going to the school dances, the kids getting their first kiss, the kids holding hands, all the things I equated with acceptance and wanted so badly. I wanted my first kiss. I wanted to be invited to the prom. But in my mind, anyone that I would ask, any girl was looking at me and saying, you're too fat, you're too ugly, you're a fat pig. So I would never ask because I projected out all these horrible things. I'm walking home with these kids about a mile from school, and I was wearing these gold, shiny, bell-bottom disco pants that my brother Mark had given me. For those who were too old to remember and have probably never seen have never seen Saturday Night Fever and John Travolta, they're the kind of pants you would imagine John Travolta. Go online and see, and then imagine them on me. No, don't imagine that. Because the pants fit Mark fine. He wasn't a big guy. The pants on me, you have to imagine these skin-tight pants where I had to jump up and down to pull them up and spray the water bottle. My butt looked like 15 cats back there. But I didn't care because my brother Mark gave me these pants, and I loved my brother, and they were a sign of his love for me, and I was going to wear those pants to school every day. And I did. And the kids made fun of me because they looked really tight on me. My stomach hung over them. But I didn't care. And one day I'm walking home with these kids and they're making fun of the pants. And they decided that I was just too, quote unquote, fat to wear these pants. They just looked too funny on me. And before I knew it, these kids, who in my mind were the popular kids, who I kept hanging around even though they bullied me and made fun of me, because one day these kids would accept me into the group and I would be the popular kid. I would now be accepted. They physically assaulted me a mile from my house and tore those pants off me, my shiny gold bell-bottom disco pants, tore them into shreds, down to my Fruit of the Loom tighty whities. Imagine me now wearing my tighty whitey pants from Sears and Roebuck, a shirt, my tube socks from the 70s, and these kids go on laughing like they had done the funniest thing ever. I go out in the street, I pick up the shreds, I go back to the sidewalk, I put them over my underwear, and I waddle on home. No one stopped, people gawked. And I got home and I went into our basement. In those days, growing up in Pittsburgh, PA, we had what was called an incinerator, where we put our garbage. I threw those pants into the incinerator to incinerate that moment and wipe out any inkling of what had happened. But of course, I couldn't wipe it out in my mind that I had been shamed and that I felt ashamed of myself. And these kids had validated everything I felt about myself. And it was right around there, Kristen, right around then that I remember really thinking to myself that I was this fat pig who would never be loved, who would never have a girlfriend, who would never get that first kiss, and who would be alone his entire life, and that no one loved him. And that now my brother wouldn't love me because I had allowed these bullies to take away the pants he had given me and destroy them. And it was then that I remember looking in the mirror and seeing this monster, just seeing this fat, ugly monster. It was the beginnings of body dysmorphic disorder. And body dysmorphic disorder is when you take a smaller or even non-existent perceived defect in your reflection and exaggerate it to the point where it affects your ability to function, quote unquote, normally in life. For me, I saw this huge stomach. Other people may exaggerate a smaller, even non-existent defect in their face where they don't leave the house. And so, or plastic surgery becomes a problem. It actually became a problem for me. I spent a lot of money on plastic surgery. And so this fat pig now that I saw in the mirror, I would carry with me to my freshman year in college. My father drove me to my freshman year at Penn State. In my mind, I was so happy because I would get away from the bullies. It would be a whole new Brian. I would make friends. I am in the dorm, Kristen, my freshman year. I'm looking out this dorm window into the parking lot, seeing all these kids, and everyone's happy, everyone's having a good time. My father's helping me unpack. Everything's great. This beautiful, crisp, cool Penn State fall morning that could transform me into a new Brian. I make eye contact with this brown, curly-haired girl. She's talking to a couple of her friends. Just boom, like I'm looking at you. I'm just making eye contact. I start sweating. In my mind, I envision my life with this girl in the next 15 seconds. We're going to date. We're going to get married. We're going to have 2 and 1/2 children. That's my new girlfriend. Somebody likes me. She turns to her friend. She looks at me, puts her hands over her mouth and goes, ugly, ugly. Now, I am not the first young man or young woman to have nasty things said to him. Bullying happened law school, and it happens between adults. Not a lot's changed except in the way it happens. Back then it was brick and mortar, someone going ugly, right? Or someone tearing off your pants. Going viral meant 15 kids in the lunchroom knew about it.
Right.
A much different era.
Yeah.
But it didn't hurt any less. And it was just that one more thing. And I don't blame that girl for it. I mean, I don't blame her. But it was just that one more thing that, in my mind, validated that chain of events. And I remember thinking in that moment, we remember bright line moments in eating disorders and addiction. You remember bright line moments. That was one of my bright line moments when I decided my entire life was out of control. Again, really validating I would never be loved, not by my mother, who did love me, but in my mind, she didn't. That validating a lifetime of unhappiness and a future that I could no longer see other than unhappiness. How could I get control of my life? What did I have control over? Nothing. Well, no one thing. I had control over food. But I didn't want to eat more to soothe myself because I associated that with bullying. I would just get bullied more. What was my path to love and acceptance? Well, I had to lose weight. I had to become thin like that girl. I had to become thin like everyone in my mind who was popular in high school, right? Because those days we didn't have the internet. Our images were the kids we saw every day, the popular kids, the prom queen, the prom king. And in my mind, and this was the images I carried to Penn State, they were all beautiful, good looking, thin, or muscular. That was it. Those were all the popular kids. No one was fat. So I had to get thin. How could I do, and that was the road to popularity and acceptance and self-acceptance. So I began to restrict my food intake and restrict and restrict and restrict. And before I knew it, I had descended into anorexic behavior at a time when no one was talking about it. This was 1979.
Especially among men.
Especially among men. The singer Karen Carpenter hadn't passed away yet. She was a wonderful singer, and she passed away from complications related to anorexia. But she kind of brought anorexia for females into the pre-digital national spotlight. But for a guy, forget it. I didn't know what eating disorders were. I didn't know what anorexia was. And later that same year, I transitioned into bulimia, which is the act of binging and purging. And I know this is an addiction conference, but you have to understand the transition of behaviors to understand how I got where I am today. And my eating disorders were a part of that transition. So I transitioned into binging and purging. And every time I binged and purged, I got high, like those few moments, everything was going to be okay. The next day would be okay. The next day, the bullies would like me. The next day, that girl would like me. The next day, my mother would love me. But of course, when those few moments and that high went away, the shame fills the void. The shame sweeps into my stomach. The shame of an act that I didn't understand. I didn't know what bulimia was, but an act that in a few seconds, of peace. So I over and over again, and the life of a male bulimic, the life of a failed bulimic. And so that was the beginning of it. Okay, Kristen, because I just saw a picture freeze.
Yep. I was waiting to see if it was going to.
Kristen, can you hear me?
I can hear you, but your face is frozen. So I don't know why. Can you hear me?
Couldn't binge blanket to me, and it was something that made me feel whole for a few moments. But then you have to deal with the cycle of shame, feeling whole, the cycle of shame, feeling whole, and that's not an uncommon process and not an uncommon cycle in bulimia. I graduated. I finished my freshman year at Penn State, and I went on to my sophomore year, and I turned 21. And before I knew it, I was a problem drinker using alcohol, because if I couldn't binge and purge my way into self-love, I would deaden my shame. I was drinking every morning, almost. I was going to class hungover. I was going to class drunk. I was going to class intoxicated. I was drinking at night. I would have to get drunk just to leave the house to socialize, because if I socialized sober, they were all looking at me and thinking, that's a fat pig. I could never be his friend. I will never like him. And I was projecting that. So the only way to deaden that feeling was to drink. And before I knew it, moving into my junior year at Penn State, I was a quote unquote alcoholic. And I was not aware of any kind of treatment. I did not know what an alcoholic was. I remember the closest I came to any self-awareness in addiction recovery back then with regard to my problem drinking was walking into a hamburger joint. In the 12-step groups, the largest alcohol-related 12-step group is Alcoholics Anonymous. The 12-step groups put out these pamphlets called the 20 questions. Answer this many questions, and you in the positive, and you just might, yes, I mean, sprinkle the basket. I'm just a college student. We all drink. That was about it. That was about as close as I came. But I was able to graduate from Penn State, and I did okay because I was able to really sometimes pull it together before a test, pull an all-nighter, and give back the information the next day, which works in college, but I found out it doesn't work too well in law school. And so I graduated from Penn State. I wanted to be a police officer. That would have worked out well, right? I would have been the first guy in the evidence room stealing the cocaine. But I'm sitting in the placement office deciding what I want to do with my life. I was the criminal justice major, and I know I really didn't want to go out in the real world, because if I go out in the real world, I have to show everyone all of these disorders that I own and I'm keeping to myself. And there were two guys talking about going to law school, and the bells start going off in my head. Ding, ding, ding. Maybe I'll go to law school. I never thought about going to law school before. I didn't think of it in terms of, well, I can be a lawyer and that'll be great. My thought process was, those bells were, I can stay in school for 3 more years, I can binge and purge, I can drink, and I don't have to reveal my true self to anyone. I don't have to reveal the ugliness I feel inside to anyone. I don't have to reveal the ugliness I see in the mirror to anyone. That made perfect sense to me. That is why I went to the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. It was not to change the world. It was not to make a lot of money. It was not to help people as a lawyer. It was to hide for 3 more years, to hide from myself. And that made perfect sense, to me. So I took the law school admission test, and I did well enough to get into the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. And I remember pushing open the doors of the Pitt Law the first day I walked in there for 1L orientation, looking around the lobby at all the law students and projecting that every one of those kids were looking at me and saying, that's a fat pig. You'll never be one of us. You'll never make it here. And I think I even saw that curly brown-haired girl in there. Every girl, every female in that lobby was that curly brown-haired girl. And I immediately knew that I had made the perfect decision to go to Pitt Law. I did. I had made the perfect decision because this is the way it was going to be all my life. I was right. I could hide for 3 more years and everything would be fine. I could repeat those cycles. I didn't make the perfect decision because I would do well in Pitt Law. I made the perfect decision because my projection of thoughts validated everything that As you might imagine, I wasn't a very good student at law. Studying all night before an exam works okay in college. It doesn't work well in law school. I graduated by the skin of my teeth. I still have reoccurring dreams, Kirsten, about the dean of my law school. I go to pick up my diploma, and I'm grabbing for my diploma, and the dean of the law school is pulling it back and going, psych, you really didn't graduate. And I wake up grabbing for my diploma. But I did graduate, not as a very good law student. And once again, I have to decide, what am I going to do with my life? What decisions am I going to make? And once again, it was about hiding. How can I hide? Well, I have my law degree. I can't stay in school forever. I decided that I would move from Pittsburgh to Dallas, Texas, because both my brothers lived here in Dallas. And the love of my brothers would save me. I could be with my brothers. I would move in with my older brother, Mark, and everything would be fine. Their love would be all I would need to get me through life. If only love could cure addiction. It doesn't work that way. So I moved to Dallas, Texas in 1986. I moved in with Mark, and it was like throwing gasoline on a fire because they're young. They're in their late 20s. They're going out. They're having a good time. I fit right in. My drinking got worse. They didn't really notice anything. I hid my binging and purging very well. I had become an expert in camouflaging my binging and purging dating back to college, so nobody would know. My law school roommates didn't know. I've talked to them about this. We didn't know you were bulimic. We didn't know you had a drinking problem. Good. that I was, I was doing what I wanted. I was accomplishing what I needed to accomplish. So you didn't know. Not good, not good in reality, but I had a PhD in camouflaging these behaviors. And in Dallas, it was just more of the same. And then in the summer of 1987, in the bathroom of a upscale hotel befitting my upscale addiction status, I was a high-class addict. I discovered the one thing that for 20 seconds, 30 seconds, I looked in the mirror for the first time in my life, and I loved the person I saw in the mirror. For the first time in my life, for 30 seconds, that curly brown-haired girl loved me. My mother loved me. Everybody loved Brian. Dallas loved Brian. I discovered cocaine. First line in that hotel in Texas, and I instantly became psychologically addicted to cocaine. Not biologically, not physically. There is a difference between psychological addiction and physical dependence. The physical dependence would come later, and I would go through a brutal withdrawal. But I became addicted to looking in that mirror and loving myself. Because having hated myself for so long with this emptiness in my stomach, when that artificial feeling just swoops in, who wouldn't want that? Who would not want to feel that feeling for the first time, that overpowering, overwhelming feeling of self-love, even though artificially created? I had to have that again and again and again. Cocaine and alcohol took over my life. It took over my life in the practice of law. It took over my life in my personal life. It took over my life through 3 failed marriages, all failing because I spent more energy in hiding my drug and alcohol issues than allowing myself to love and to be loved. It's not uncommon in relationships that are affected by addiction. When you put up this wall, this brick wall around yourself to hide what you feel about yourself, to hide what you are going through, and you put all your energy into that doesn't leave much room to let love in, and it doesn't leave any room to let love out. Yeah. And it eventually takes the path of least resistance to your significant other saying, you don't love me. And to say that I do means having to open yourself up, means having to risk, means having to stop projecting, means having to take a chance that the person that you marry, the person that really does love you wants to help you, instead of looking at you and saying, that's just a fat pig. You're not worthy of my love. It becomes easier to say, you're right, I don't. 3 marriages failing that exact same way. None of them lasting more than 2 years.
Wow.
It all finally came to a head in the summer of 2005 when I became so despondent, I became so hopeless that I would ever love myself, that I would ever be loved by anyone, that I decided to end my own life.
Yeah, hold on 1 second, Brian. Brian, just pause right there, and all of our viewers, just hold on 1 second. We're going to be right.
Your own business. Risk being told to mind your. That's all right. Well, okay, where were we?
You were talking relationships.
Right. So the 3 marriages ended pretty much like that. December 2005, I really decided that there was no hope for the future and no hope of ever loving myself, of ever looking in that mirror and seeing anything but a fat pig and this huge monster born of body dysmorphic disorder. Yeah. I decided to take my life, and it was close. My 2 brothers, at the urging of a friend who did not mind his own business, and that's one of the things I talk about now in suicide awareness prevention, do not mind your own business. Risk being told to mind your own business. Risk it. He alerted my 2 brothers that he felt something was wrong. When I emailed him for bullets to a gun, my 2 brothers came in my house. I was upstairs. There was the .45 automatic on my nightstand. Drugs everywhere, alcohol everywhere, black market Xanax everywhere. My younger brother came first. Mark flew in from Los Angeles. He waited for me. My younger brother took the weapon, cleaned up all the drugs and alcohol. And they took me in my first of 2 trips down to a local psychiatric facility, kicking and screaming. They're trying to save my life, my brothers who love me. I am thinking, just leave me alone. Let me finish what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
There was a close between what was happening, what I thought about myself in those moments. So they take me to the psychiatric facility. I'm a lawyer. I know what to say. I'm not a danger to myself. I'm not a danger to others. And in Texas, they couldn't hold me. So much to the chagrin of my 2 brothers, they couldn't hold me, and they had to take me back home. My brothers wanted to commit me, and they couldn't. So we did what I call the Cuban rehab. My brothers said, just stay in your house for 2 weeks. We'll take your car keys and everything's going to be fine. If only that worked, right? But my family's no different. My family was no different. All I thought about was no problem. My drug dealer delivers. Just go ahead and drop me off at home. They dropped me off at home. And for 2 weeks, my drug dealer delivered, and I learned 2 things from that experience. One, that I had to distance from my family, okay? Because not that I had a problem, that I had to distance from my family. And 2, that I had to distance from other people in my life who cared about me. So I started only hanging around with these people who did cocaine and drank. And now, I am really just off the rails. 2006 comes around. My brother's NBA basketball team, the Dallas Mavericks, are going to the NBA championship for the very first time. And this is just to show you the quote unquote insanity of addiction. I had the opportunity to get some really good seats for friends for those games. So I call my brother and I get some tickets for my friends. This was our first trip to the championship. It was a very big thing for the city, for my family. And so I get a couple tickets, some very nice seats for friends, and I didn't give them to my friends. You're probably thinking I sold them on sold them on eBay for some astronomical amount. I didn't do that either because that would be disrespectful to my family, to the team, to the city. I took them and traded them to my cocaine dealer for $1,000 in cocaine. Selling them on eBay is disrespectful, but trading them to my cocaine dealer is perfectly acceptable in my mind, how the mind works in addiction, right? So my cocaine dealer shows up in my house. I was a high-class addict. He delivered. The things we tell ourselves in addiction.
Yeah, of course.
I give him the 2 tickets. He hands me the cocaine. I run up to my home office. I dump all the cocaine out on my desk. I'm looking at it. My face in it. I have to do something. That's why I bought it. But cocaine at this point, this is now 2006, had long stopped giving me the feeling that I had first gotten when I did it in 1987. A feeling of love and acceptance. And I had been chasing this feeling now for a long time that was never going to come again. Now it was just paranoia and pain. Well, maybe I need to change dealers. Maybe I need a new grade of cocaine. It was never about, maybe I have a problem.
Yeah.
I did some, and I got paranoid, thinking I hear the cops outside, thinking that I see the street lights, the police lights. Woo, woo, woo. So I take the cocaine, I put it back in the Ziploc baggie that my dealer had given to me in. I put it in the closet and I drive to a Home Depot. I'm sure everyone listening or watching knows what a Home Depot is, a home improvement store. And I buy electrical faceplate outlets, a drill, and a saw. I drive back to my house. I go to the drywall in each closet in my house, bzz, 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 and I drill a fake electrical outlet in the drywall of each closet. And I put the cocaine in separate Ziploc baggies and put a little bit behind each fake electrical outlet and close it back up, bzz, 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 thinking I'm the smartest lawyer ever. Like the cops, the DEA, and the drug dogs have never thought of that one before. right? But I thought I was being brilliant. I do a little more. Just once again, just pain and shame. Same evening, paranoia. I go back to each electrical outlet. Bzz, 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 take the cocaine back out of each electrical outlet the same evening because I'm paranoid. Put it back in the original Ziploc baggie and I flush it down the toilet. The next morning comes, there's another game. And as so often happens when a perceived negative event gets in the rearview mirror in addiction, I'm such an idiot. What did I do? I flushed all my cocaine down the toilet. There's another game tonight. Another call to my brother, Mark. Another call, 2 more tickets. Another call to my drug dealer. He shows up at my house, Kirsten. And I'm sorry, is it Kristen or Kirsten? I keep interchanging.
No, it doesn't. It's Kirsten.
Kirsten, okay.
All good.
So he shows up at my house and he's looking at me, dude, you did all that cocaine? I didn't want to tell him I'd flush it down the toilet. Yes, I did it all. I am the king cocaine of Dallas. I need more. I have a huge tolerance. Give me more. Okay, man. Here's another bag. Give him 2 more tickets. Take the baggie. Do some more. Once again, just pain and shame. Once more paranoia. Back to each closet with the drill. Bzz, bzz, bzz. Once again, put a little behind each closet and hide it. Once again, try some more. Paranoia, take it out, and flush it down the toilet again. 2 nights, flush $2,000. Well, now probably about $970. $970 each night in cocaine. 2 nights, flush almost $1,000 in cocaine down the toilet. The paranoia of addiction, and I had become paranoid, and the quote-unquote insanity of addiction, right? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. But addiction is not insane. It is a biological process. It is a brain disease that it affects millions of people. And I was no different. Yeah. I was an alcoholic. I was addicted to cocaine. I had an eating disorder. I was not in recovery of any type. And I was really at a bottom in my life. My career as a lawyer was gone. My brother Mark gave me a job working for him. I failed miserably, showing up to work drunk, showing up to work high, not showing up to work. But Mark kept me on the payroll because he wanted to know at least that I was alive, even though I really wasn't doing anything. Well, isn't that enabling? Sure. And Kirsten, I admittedly was in a very privileged situation. 99.999% of the people out there don't have the privilege that I had to have a billionaire brother who was making sure that I stayed alive and making sure that, that I had a place. Yeah. I acknowledged that privilege. But addiction doesn't know privilege. Addiction doesn't know demographics. Addiction cuts across all swaths of demographics and economics. Yeah. And so I was just back out there, just doing it, unemployed, being supported by my brother. And then in January of 2006, I had met a girl. I had met a girl named Amanda, and we had started dating. I met her when I was out at one of my week-long birthday celebrations in Dallas. They would start, my birthday's on January 11th, and it would start when the cocaine started, and it would end when the cocaine ended, and it would go all week at a different bar, or I'd go to Las Vegas, or I'd go to Miami where people wouldn't know me, but they were generally week-long celebrations. This one was in Dallas, January 11, 2006. She came into this place where I was celebrating. She doesn't use drugs, and she was a very light drinker. She happened to come in after a football game, and we started talking, and I was able to pull it together to look halfway respectable, and we started dating, and she moved in with me, and again, I had a PhD still in hiding my issues, even though it was getting harder and harder, because as we know, when we sink deeper and deeper into addiction, the window closes and it becomes harder and harder to wear those masks, right? As we approach that point where everything comes together, where that gray area between love, enablement, recovery comes together, it becomes hard to hide it. And I was able to hide it only for shorter periods of time, but she moved in with me, and it was Easter weekend 2007. She went away to visit her parents. The next thing I knew, it was a Friday. The next thing I knew, Kirsten, I'm in bed. She's looking down at me. 2 days had passed. There's cocaine everywhere. There's alcohol everywhere. I'd had a 2-day drug and alcohol-induced blackout. I had gone out. I don't remember where. She's looking down at me, thinking, did I walk in the right house? I'm looking up at her thinking, what lie can I tell to get me to explain this, the scene? And she's a lawyer as well. She wasn't buying any of it. So I decided, okay, I kind of ran home to Mama. Take me back to Green Oak Psychiatric Facility. I can think of a lie on our way there. You've been to a psychiatric facility? Oh yeah, there are some things I haven't told you about my past. And so we go back to Green Oak Psychiatric Facility, Easter weekend, 2007. We're standing in the parking lot of Green Oaks waiting for admission. She's crying, and I'm thinking she's gone. And a few things occurred to me in that parking lot, standing there waiting for admission. One, there wouldn't be a third trip back because I'd be dead. Two, she was going to leave me. I'd leave me. I mean, we hadn't been dating that long. She actually stood by me. She stood by me, and she stuck with me while I found recovery. We dated for over a decade. While I found recovery and rebuilt the broken trust, rebuilt the trust I destroyed. Not for her, I had to do it for me, because tragedy happens, people come and people go, and recovery has to withstand all of that, no matter what happens. It had to be for me, not for anyone else. And we ended up getting married, and we'll have our 2-year anniversary next month. So,
And congratulations.
thank you. So not all relationships will survive these things, but it is possible. But I had to do the work, and I had to do it for me.
Unbelievable.
And the third thing I thought about in that parking lot was something our father had said to Mark, Jeff, and I growing up. He would say, guys, wives may come and go, and he's kidding. You know, he's being tongue-in-cheek. Girlfriends may come and go, and he's kidding, of course. But when push comes to shove, all you have is each other. No matter where, he said, no matter where you go in life, no matter where your journey takes you, no matter where you end up, you stay close. You call your brother. You tell your brother you. My father, like me, was the middle of 3 boys. He understood the bond of brothers, and he understood family. And he was giving us that gift that he had been given by his parents, the bond of family. He was passing that down to us.
Yeah.
And I thought about that in that parking lot, and I wasn't ready to give that up because my brothers had started to distance from me. That didn't mean they didn't love me, but they don't want someone who's high on cocaine, hungover, hanging around their nieces and nephews. I wouldn't want that either if I were them. I understood. And I was distancing from them.
Right.
And I didn't want to lose my family. I didn't want to lose that. And if you want to know how that gift stuck, all these decades later, 2018, from Pittsburgh, all these miles away from Pittsburgh, PA, Mark, Jeff, and I all live walking distance to each other. And until my father passed away 2 months ago, he lived across the street from me.
Wow.
That is how that gift stuck. I know everyone here is asking, what about your mother? What happened? That's an important question. My mother and I have a great relationship today. I was very lucky. My mother was willing to step into my recovery and talk about how about the mentally abusive relationship she had with her mother, the tools she was giving, her verbally abusive mother. Her mother had her own mental health issues. And there was a very verbally abusive relationship and a very dysfunctional relationship around food with her and her mother. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't making excuses. And I wasn't looking for that. She said, this is the way it was. And when we both understood that as adults all these years later, other versus as a teen, where we just couldn't talk about those things, all the decades of blame and silence and cross-blame for something we couldn't verbalize to each other went away.
Yeah.
And I was able to forgive. and she forgave me. And it was fine. And it was fine. We were able to cross all those barriers of miles and shame and generational shaming and come to peace with it. And that was an important moment for me, that my mother and I were able to do that, because coming to peace with my past has been so important. Coming to peace and dealing with the trauma of my childhood was so important. When I talk to lawyers and law students or anyone dealing with eating disorders or addiction, it's easy to, if we're talking, we're going to talk about where we are, right? I'm having this drinking problem. I'm having this problem. I'm having, I binge and purge. That's, if we're going to talk, that's what we're talking about. But when you start talking about how you got there, that becomes very difficult. I've had people tell me for the first time about physical abuse, about sexual abuse.
Yes.
And I am not a treatment provider, so obviously I say, we need to help you get to somebody. But the hardest part for me, Kirsten, was not dealing with where I am. Getting sober was hard, but that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was carrying back all the layers of my life.
The emotional underpinnings of the illness,
Yes.
yeah.
Back to that bullied, hurt, shameful feeling little boy who didn't think he would ever be loved. The hardest part of my life, and something I do ongoing and talking to that little boy and telling him he was loved, was cutting that chain that I had been dragging around with that little hurt little boy on it, on this huge tire on a gravel driveway, dragging it through my life as this huge weight on me, instead of working on letting him know he was loved, that it's okay, and letting him grow up and cutting that tire. And I work on that in counseling every day. I went into 12-step. I'm still in 12-step today. That may not be for everyone, but that was my journey, going into 12-step, alcohol-focused 12-step. AA is the most well-known one. I see a psychiatrist. I have a funny story about my psychiatrist.
Huh.
The day after all of this happened in the psychiatric facility and Amanda moved out, I go into my psychiatrist's office, who I had been seeing for a few years, and just lying. Well, why would you lie to your psychiatrist? Shame knows no hourly rate, right? I was ashamed. And so I was just getting antidepressants, telling I'm depressed, and mixing antidepressants with cocaine and alcohol works really well, let me tell you. So it really was kind of a wash. Nothing productive was happening. And I finally got honest with him about everything but the eating disorder. I was still too ashamed as a guy. And at that point, I knew I had an eating disorder. I'm in my 40s. And so we started talking about that. And he said, Brian, we have a lot of issues we have to work on yet. Well, I hope I'm paying you for more than that. But you have to get sober. Would you consider residential treatment? And I kind of blew, I'm not going to residential treatment. There are no lawyers in residential treatment, right? Of course there are. Yeah. And I'm an important lawyer. I have no clients, but I heard a car accident right out front, and I'm going to go get that guy, and I'll have a client. So I'm an important lawyer. My ego front and center. Would you consider 12-step? I'm not going into 12-step. There are no lawyers in 12-step. Of course, I walked in there, and half of them were lawyers. I can't go to 12-step. They smoke. I see them. I go by there, and they smoke. I don't smoke. I can't. The secondhand smoke will kill me. So, see the irony there. If you see the irony there, all right, there's always a reason to recover. But I finally did walk through the doors of 12-step. I finally did get honest with my psychiatrist, who I still see today. Been seeing him for 15 years. There's no shame in treatment. I finally opened up and allowed myself to feel the shame, to talk about the shame. Shame is one of the big gatekeepers of recovery. Yes. The inability to talk about shame.
Yes.
So that is an ongoing process that brings me to today. I am moving on 12 years in recovery. I still see my psychiatrist. I still go to 12-step now and then. I have a wonderful relationship with my wife. I have a wonderful relationship with my mother. I've even forgiven the bullies. I've forgiven those kids from all those years ago. I'm Facebook friends with a couple of those kids.
Wow.
I get asked all the time, don't you want them to know? Don't you want to tell them? I say, no, this isn't a reality show. I'm not,
Right.
I'm not more, this is more, 14-year-old kids or 57-year-old men who have children and grandchildren. There's no point in dragging that up. What I want for them is to have happy lives, hopefully having not repeated cycles and teaching their kids differently about bullying. That's all I want for them. Then they were taught at a time when we weren't talking about bullying. There was no such word.
Yeah.
I mean, we weren't talking about that. No, of course not. And so it's interestingly, I got a Facebook friend request from my drug dealer who delivered. And
Interesting. What do you do with that?
said, huh?
What does one do with that?
Well, I said, dude, hand-to-hand cocaine exchanges on a college campus isn't a friendship. Okay, that's a business. If you're coming to me in recovery, I'm all about that. If you're coming to me in recovery, great. Everyone has a past, right? I have so many different friends in recovery who have been to prison, who have been this, that. Everyone has a past. I have a past. I've been to jail. I got my obligatory DWI dealing with all this stuff. I've been to jail. That was fun. They love lawyers in jail. They love to give lawyers a hard time in jail.
Brian, your story is, and I've read bits and pieces of it before, is so phenomenal, and partially because not everyone makes it to where you are. Sadly, as we know, addiction kills. Eating disorders kill. And families don't all have happy endings. And there is just so much brokenness in this field that people can lose hope. But you are this beacon of light and hope. And I wonder if there's someone listening to this today who feels like they've been struggling with their addiction and eating disorder and alcohol addiction for decades. How can they know that there is a brighter future?
It's a cliche to say recovery is possible, but it is. Recovery is possible. The hardest thing for me was breaking through that, stepping over this line. Okay, there is this line in wherever we go, this wall we put up that seems that's there, but it's not there. Okay,
right.
The fear of stepping over that into the unknown can keep someone in active addiction and active eating disorder for almost their entire life, or having tried once and not got where they want to be. Recovery is possible. Disorders or addiction. Please pick yourself up. Step again. Reach out. People want to help. There are so many resources out there today that were not available when I was going through this. And remember, I did not go into recovery until a lot of those resources were available. Okay, I didn't go into I struggled with eating disorders for over 2 decades. I struggled with addiction for a long time. And so now, today, is I am still in recovery and I take advantage of these resources. People love you. People want to help you. And what happens is we project out the worst. We project out the absolute worst and get lost in that thought instead of stepping back and allowing yourself to be loved. Allow yourself to be loved because people want to help you. I'll help you. I'm sure you're available. People, there are all these resources. I mean, people do want to help, even if it's not your immediate family. Step out from the immediate family. Not everyone, there are a lot of dysfunctional families out there. My family is dysfunctional. We had our issues. But if you don't feel you can get it there at this moment, that's fine. Take a step back from that. Do you have a friend you can talk to? No. Take a step back from that. Is there something on a place online you can go to? No. Well, yeah, there is. Contact me. Contact you, right? You may not, maybe you're not going to the right place. There are all these resources. We may be able to help guide you. Recovery is possible. People want to help. You are loved, and you are enough.
An incredible message, Brian. I could just listen to you all day long, and I know that many of the people watching could as well. But we are going to let you go and say thank you from the bottom of our hearts for your honesty and vulnerability and truth. It is exceptional. And I just want to thank you very, very much.
Well, thanks. And thanks for everything you do to raise awareness, Kirsten. And I hope to talk to you again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Brian. And just, Brian, before we go, you know, we're going to, you know, feature this video on Addiction Hope, where there are so many of those resources that Brian mentioned that we've talked about where people can get help if this story was inspiring to you. And Brian, also, why don't you let people know the name of your book again and where people can find it?
Sure. And first, anyone who needs help can reach out to me at briancuban.com. I will help you find a path. And you need resources, or the Addiction Hope and Eating Disorder Hope are wonderful resources. But you know, if you need support, reach out to me. And you can find my book, The Addicted Lawyer: Tales of the Bars, Booze, and Redemption, on Bars, Booze, Blow, and Redemption. I don't know the title of my book.
Perfect. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Brian, so much for your time. We will see you next time, and thank you so much for being such a good friend of Addiction Hope.
Thanks, and thanks for having me on this wonderful conference. Take care.
Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. We're back. And if you're just joining us now, or you joined us a little bit through Brian Cuban's presentation, welcome to our all-day online conference here at Addiction Hope. We have got our next presentation, which is set to start in about 5 minutes. So we're going to let you all take a coffee break if you'd like, maybe do a stretch, stand up, and I'm going to sign off here. I'm going to mute and sign off the video, and we will see all of you back here in 5 minutes. So don't go anywhere. Just, you can, you know, stay online, stay with us on Zoom, but we will be back with our next presenter, who is Dr. Mark Gold. He's going to be here with us live, another CE event, and that's in just about 4 or 5 minutes. So we will see you guys soon. Hey, Dr. Gold, can you start
Hey,
your
how you
video?
doing? Can you
Great.
hear
I
me?
can't see you though.
Oh, that's because I have to click the button here, right?
Yes. There you are. Hello.
Is that bright enough?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay.
So just screen share. So if you see at the bottom of the bottom like lower third there, it says participants Q&A polling, and then there's a little button that says share. Do you see
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
Perfect. So click that. And then a second window should pop up that allows you to choose which window on your desktop to share.
That's very cool. How do you like that?
Yeah. Love it. Perfect. You got it.
I must be a teenager. Thanks.
Ah,
Yeah, well, that was fun. How you doing? You need a break?
perfect. I'm great. Thank you.
Sometimes I hear you kind of echo.
Okay, well, and just after we've got our attendees coming back, and after I introduce you officially, everyone can see us right now, but once I introduce you officially and read your bio, I will just hand it over to you, and I'll sign off, and you take it by storm, so we don't need to worry about my echo at all.
Yep, it's all good with me.
Sound good? Okay, great.
Yep, thank you.
You are welcome. All righty. We'll wait maybe. Oh, all right, there we go. It is 2 p.m. Eastern. So without further ado, let's get this third conference session underway. So if everyone is joining us for our 2 p.m. session, if we've got any newbies, hello and welcome to our online conference here at Addiction Hope. If you are sticking with us from the very beginning, thank you so much. We're so glad that you are here. This is our second CE event of the day. So what that means is this is a live event. We've got Dr. Gold right there. You can see him on the screen, and he's going to give an incredible presentation. There are CEs available. So you must be here throughout the entire presentation, listening to the presentation. And then at the end of Dr. Gold's session, I'm going to copy and paste a link into the chat section right there for all attendees. So you can click that link. It goes to a Google form that you will be able to fill out so that we can get the confirmation that you were here, you attended, we get your feedback, and we could submit that to issue your CEs. So super important if these CEs are important to you and that's why you're here. Make sure that you stay all the way till the end for the Google form link and submit that to us following the presentation. So that is the rundown on that. Now let me introduce you to our next conference presenter, Dr. Mark Gold. So Dr. Gold, he serves as chairman of the Addiction and Psychiatric Scientific Advisory Board, and also as the chairman of the Eating Disorders and Obesity Scientific Advisory Board. He served as professor, the Donald Disney Eminent Scholar, distinguished professor, and chair of psychiatry from 1990 to 2014. Dr. Gold was the first faculty from the College of Medicine to be selected as a university-wide distinguished alumni professor and served as the 17th University of Florida's distinguished alumni professor. He has many more years, decades, and honors besides just those, but he is clearly a wonder and a very well-respected man in the field. So, so welcome, Dr. Gold, and I will hand it over to you.
Okay, Kirsten, thank you very much. It's fun to be here, and I liked watching Brian's presentation. And of course, I've known Pat Carnes for a good majority of his career, and I always enjoy listening to him. And I'm grateful that he cited in his talk our dopamine deficiency hypothesis and paper in the Journal of Psychedelic Drugs. I'll spend some time talking about that, but most of the talk that Kirsten and Jackie asked me to do was on behavioral addictions, food and sugar, and to keep a focus on that. But, you know, as you know, you can't have had a career in addiction medicine and been considered a pioneer and win a Lifetime Achievement Award without Oh, there you go. Let's see if that will move my slides without being able to talk a little bit about addictions. So really, we're in the middle of an opioid crisis. I put this up just because you can see that we're spiking with opioid deaths, clearly not from methadone, but from heroin and synthetic opioids. While that's been a major focus and related to these deaths of despair that everyone's focused on, at a very recent meeting, like 2 days ago, conference at the DEA headquarters in Washington, D.C., the data was presented by Bruce Goldberger and others on the causes of death and what we see when you look in post-mortem samples as far as deaths are concerned. And while opioids have received the predominant share of attention and focus, it's also true that the deaths are really from polysubstance abuse. Most of the deaths have multiple drugs. Many of the deaths where there's analysis have 3 or more drugs. And so death rates have gone up as synthetic opioids have entered the marketplace, but there still are polysubstance deaths. The most recent overdose to receive attention was Demi Lovato's. And we wrote a blog for Addiction Hope on this, in part because opioid overdoses are so common. We see them everywhere. And in her case, she was fortunate enough to, one, have people to call 911, and 2, have someone to administer Narcan or naloxone. We've been promoting naloxone availability and training, looking at it somewhat similarly to how we look at CPR. Almost everyone has been trained in CPR. Most everyone can do a Heimlich maneuver and CPR if somebody chokes or has an apparent heart attack. But without naloxone, you can't rescue someone who's had an overdose. The signs of an overdose aren't asking a person what drug they took, because oftentimes they'll think that they've taken cocaine or another drug, and lo and behold, there's fentanyl or other synthetic opioids in it. They have an overdose. So it's really unresponsiveness, awake, but really can't talk, limp, pale, clammy, sweaty, blue fingernails from lack of circulation, reduced pulse. If you had blood pressure, you'd know their blood pressure was reduced. The skin might turn and change colors, and they'd make a gurgling sound. Once Narcan is given, the person will wake up. And now we have a nasal spray so that you don't have to be trained in giving an injection or finding a vein. You can clearly just give Narcan. There's no way to overdose on Narcan. And even if the person didn't have an opioid overdose, let's say, God forbid, they had a stroke, there'd be no harm in this, or if they had overdosed on something else. So we'd like to remember the man who invented naloxone and also naltrexone, Jacob Fishman, who really created this wonder drug, and we'd like to get it out there because, as you can see, heroin is the #1 cause of overdose death, and Narcan could help with that. Cocaine, over half of the cocaine deaths are probably due to synthetic opioids and oxycodone. So most of these deaths could be reversed. Some, especially during the prescription opioid crisis, many of the overdoses were not accidental, and that just underlines the importance of treating it like you would a CPR event if someone has been rescued with CPR, we always send them to a doctor for an evaluation, comprehensive evaluation, to find out why it is that their heart stopped or why it is they had an irregular heartbeat. And they get evaluated, and treatment plan is developed. In the case of an opioid overdose, we want to be sure that they don't have a comorbid problem like depression or a comorbid physical problem like HIV, AIDS. We'd like to know that all of their medical and psychiatric problems will be treated at the same time. We'd like them to quickly enter into addiction treatment as well. So the CDC, this is just a slide to show what they recommend, and they'll say after, call 911, give Narcan, but you need to have it to be able to give it. And there are tragedies all the time in our population, and it's important to remember that it's not just the drug problem, it's often the trauma, concurrent infectious disease, heart disease, changes in the brain due to drugs or other changes, and persistent depression. And this is a depression for a good reason, because drugs, by targeting the brain's reinforcement areas over time, change them and can undermine them, as you saw in Pat Carnes' PET imaging and other imaging. And in doing that, changes the experience that the person has with the outside world and with pleasurable activities, so that even species survival behaviors, food, water, sex, become less reinforcing, as drugs of abuse are quicker and easier than all that work. Much of my career has been working on MATs and developing MATs, new treatments for cocaine and for opioid addicts. And, because I'm a basic scientist, really. My last invention is in the field of overeating and obesity, and that'll be the principal portion of the talk. But, as people know, we published the dopamine hypothesis in '84, and it's been the predominant hypothesis for how pleasure and drug addiction might occur, and might also explain anhedonia and depression. Our work led to an understanding of where opioids, that's my #2 most popular paper, worked in the brain and how you might reverse that. My problem #3 was the first demonstration of behavioral addiction, in this case, problematic internet use. And then 5 was on food. So you can see that even though these are more current projects of mine, the number of times they're liked or cited by other people in the field is increasing, and increasing so much that the word's getting out that these are really important. These are what they call citation classics, and we'll come back to dopamine again. But the moral of the story was, if cocaine could cause these changes, and these changes were synonymous with self-administration, post-drug anhedonia, misery, and craving, and continued cocaine use. Cocaine could be addicting without having a major abstinence or withdrawal syndrome. If that's the case, which it was, then cocaine should be reclassified, we claimed in '84, '85, and it was by '88 as a dangerous and addicting drug. And therefore, in addition, behaviors could be addicting, or other things which access the brain's reinforcement system, cause paying attention, craving, and wanting, and change the brain in a way consistent with cocaine, but without major abstinence syndrome. So you didn't have to have alcohol-related withdrawal or opioid-related withdrawal signs or symptoms to be addicting anymore. You could be gambling. You could be cocaine. All of the drugs of abuse cause D2 downregulation. We predicted that in '84. It was demonstrated here by Nora Volkov's group at Brookhaven. But the important part is that these downregulations occur quickly. and occur most dramatically in cocaine, methamphetamine, and opioids, and similarly, but significantly, in alcohol and food. The recovery side is a big unknown. Like, is the brain fully recovered, you might ask, from these D2 dopamine changes from in proven cocaine abstinence 6 months later? And really, the answer is no. Treatment and recovery have to work to maintain abstinence and allow exercise, diet, wellness, other treatment attributes to kick in and be successful. Our group studied cocaine, and we learned a lot that's relevant to food, relevant to sexual compulsivity, relevant to internet messaging because of the dopamine effect. But it's hard to imagine this, but our group in the 80s had the first report of cocaine addiction, first report of cocaine-inducing lifelong panic, first report of crack being used, first report of cocaine being used for appetite suppression, especially in modeling and other professions where thinness was highly valued, cocaine causing movement disorders, cocaine addiction in doctors. While it's not among the favorites in likes or citations, like the cocaine dopamine hypothesis or the noradrenergic hypothesis for opioid addiction or the invention of clonidine, we are really proud of the 5-year outcome study showing that physicians in different health care programs in different states, but who get the same physician health program treatment, followed and studied for 5 years, showed 80% positive outcome with negative urines, positive return to work and functionality. And I think this is an excellent paper to evaluate treatment and to think about treatment efficacy more like oncology with 5-year outcomes and less like 3-month or even 1-month outcomes. We worked in food, and one of the projects we did was to show that when caffeine is even present in decaffeinated coffee, the relevance of this is that caffeine could be added to beverages, and it is, to sport drinks and others, to put a drug in there that would help you sell it, and the caffeine stimulates its own taking. Similarly, sugar could be added to these, and they are as well. That's just me as a young man in '83. So having a long career in the field, my first publications in 1972, I remember the cocaine era starting and the changes in body mass, so that you basically had very thin and very heavy stars, and a lot of tragedy. So there were 8 premature deaths in Saturday Night Live, all of them cut short, brilliant careers, but gave people in the proximity and people who were watching a chance to see the interaction between sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and lead us again to rethink what addiction is on the basis of the experience in the 80s and on the basis of the cocaine epidemic. So what's an addiction? Could be gambling, could be food, could be internet, could be texting, could be the traditional drugs of abuse, as well as sex. And this is now summarized in an American Psychiatric Association textbook called Behavioral Addictions, which has chapters on all of these. And as Pat Carnes said, they're at various stages of approval for being considered addictions like anything else. So the DSM-5 was the first to include gambling, but of course gaming is in the international update. Our group showed that animals will press a lever for food. This is important because we define drugs of abuse, traditional drugs of abuse, on their ability to stimulate their own taking. So if you stick an animal in a chamber and put cocaine in an IV fluid and it's getting an IV of cocaine, and compare that to giving it an IV worth of water, compare that to methamphetamine or heroin, you can show that drugs of abuse are self-administered, meaning use it once, use it again, and they basically will use it depending on what schedule you allow them. This led us to think that sugar was similar to other drugs of abuse, and we worked for many years. I worked with Bart Hubble, Nicole Lavina, and others at Princeton, and after Bart's death, continued the lab at Princeton for a number of years. He was really the pioneer here, comparing morphine self-administration to sugar self-administration. And Nicole Lavina and I refined that work to develop a screening method, which is my latest patent, to look at what would happen if you added sugar to yogurt, to a sports drink. And if you model that in animals, you could use the self-administration of sugar as a model to develop new treatments, especially cutting down on sugar, ability to reinforce ongoing activity. So if you think about sugar self-administration like we think about alcohol self-administration, the treatment for alcohol self-administration is either detox in AA, or it's harm reduction approach, which is medically assisted treatment using naltrexone. Naltrexone blocks alcohol's free access to brain reinforcement systems, so therefore people drink less. That it's not an abstinence approach. We moved this work to Yale, and Kelly Brownell and I, Kelly's the dean at the School of Public Health at Duke, brought together a panel of experts, and we put it all together in this textbook that's you can use to fall asleep. With Mark Potenza and Nora Volkov, we presented food and sugar, that's my work, gambling, Potenza's work, and then the holistic, all the behaviors and dopamine imaging, Nora Volkov's work at a recent international ASAM meeting. And, asking the question, what's more addictive? And if you ask this question, Oreos or cocaine, it's clearly cocaine, but people do feel a special attention and attraction to Oreos. And it's in the same system, but it's much more diminished. But it's important for us to think about in our research. So we thought about a number of ways. We could train animals to self-administer cocaine and feed them a steak, and self-administration rates go down if they'll eat the steak. That's very remarkable. And we could train animals to self-administer sugar and find what the relationship of that was to just other behaviors that a rat might perform, including exercise. This is summarized in the CASA, Columbia University booklet on food and addiction. It's free. You can download it just by Googling CASA food and food addiction. So what other lessons did we learn? We learned lessons from cigarettes. We learned that cigarette smoking.
Yes or no? Do you believe nicotine is not addictive?
I believe nicotine is not addictive. Yes.
These are all the executives of the tobacco companies.
Congressman, cigarettes and nicotine clearly do not meet the classic definitions of addiction.
I don't believe that nicotine or our products are addictive. I believe nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
And I too believe that nicotine is not addictive.
So the question really is nicotine and cigarette smoking addictive? The answer is yes. What lessons can we learn from that relates to food? And that is a very interesting question, and I've studied this in animals and people. Obviously, smoking was promoted, especially to women, on this Virginia Slims or keep a slender figure basis. Nicotine is a psychoactive ingredient, one of many that are released by combusting a cigarette and gets into the brain and changes the brain and body, causing mild antidepressant effects, mild anti-anxiety effects, and causing both of those, anxiety and depression, to happen in abstinence. But our work said, well, like weight gain or occurs after smoking cessation. That's a way that people are uncomfortable after they discontinue smoking, and they gain a lot of weight over a 12-month period, 5 kilograms, and that causes some people to relapse. We showed the same thing for amphetamine. It's been shown for most drugs of abuse, but cigarette smoking, the #1 preventable cause of death globally, and weight gain is cited as a main cause of relapse. And so this has been studied, hoping that we'd find new treatments or find a new way of understanding what drives appetite. But to us, it is more than one driver. It's more than just dopamine, but cigarette smoking offers us a clue. Cigarette smoking itself is another example of a typical addiction, meaning detox isn't treatment. Mark Twain said that clearly. Stopping smoking is the easiest thing I've ever done. I've done it hundreds of times. So for alcohol or tobacco or other drugs, it's the same. For cannabis, we have a lot of experience because, again, I was a fellow and medical student during the height of the cannabis studies, and there's association between marijuana smoking and a drive to eat. Now, in marijuana addicts, when they stop or are given cannabinoid antagonists, we do find that they gain weight. But in the acute or irregular use, marijuana smoking causes a drive to eat. And this has now been studied by Yale researchers to look at how it is that this happens, where in the brain this happens. And so you have the Yale study saying that the two effects together of smoking cannabis give you a runaway hunger. Even if you just had dinner, all of a sudden the neurons tell you that you're hungry. This has been utilized, this effect, by entrepreneurial cookie salespeople selling Girl Scout cookies, where it was just covered on TV in San Diego that they're setting up their cookie stands outside of marijuana dispensaries. Again, so there's going to be a lesson in the tobacco addiction and withdrawal, and there's going to be a lesson in the cannabis effect. And maybe they're related because cannabis and tobacco have more in common than you think. Some of the tobacco-induced changes in the brain are to change the brain's own cannabinoid systems. So the 60s, what did I learn then? Well, I learned that if you had sex, drugs, and rock and roll in Woodstock, you didn't really think very much about food. And that was kind of Woodstock. And you can see the before and after the rains effect. Before there's food tents and after there's not much of anything. And so that was a lesson. I learned a lot by detoxing opioid addicts. And what we did was we detoxed them from opioids using clonidine or lofexidine and put them on naltrexone. All these are common MATs, but the main finding was that they gained weight. So if they were opioid abstinents, they had a rebound hyperphagia and gained weight. I learned something in the snowstorm of the century, 1978. So I was running the Yale Medically Assisted Treatment Program, the methadone program, and at that time, in 78, the snow was so bad, we had 300 people, I think, on methadone at that time as a maintenance, and we wanted to be sure they had their doses. And so I had to try to get to the clinic, which I did. There was no electricity, there were no cell phones, but a nurse and I could be there to dispense the methadone if clients made it to the clinic. And they did have a hard time doing that. The state troopers did manage to get me there, and you can see it was not that easy to get around. That was the Connecticut Turnpike. I don't even think they had snowmobiles or anything that could get through. But you know, the trucks did start to work, and you know, people were stranded. I wasn't stranded, but I was able to get through these kind of winding pathways that we dug out. And over time, over the 3 days, people did come into the clinic. Very few people came in the first day. Very few people came in the second day. But we did see a lot of people then who came in who had withdrawal. And so heroin withdrawal and methadone withdrawal looks like the person's physically uncomfortable, they have nausea and vomiting, but they'll tell you that they can take the early stages of withdrawal and cause it to go away by eating sugar, by putting sugar in a spoon, pretending that they're going to inject it, heat it up, pretending that it's heroin, drawing it up in a syringe, pretending they'll inject themselves, skin popping themselves, and doing everything that was in their drug ritual. And this could remove the withdrawal. It would always come back, but remove it. And then when they were really desperate, they just became drunk. So they would drink and drink and drink. And that was another lesson. I remembered that revolutionary and Civil War analgesia, even for amputations, was carried out with, whiskey and alcohol. So again, the commonality between alcohol and drugs of abuse, alcohol and opioid systems. And that all reminded me of this classic study by Gene Redmond's group, taking the green vervet monkeys of St. Kitts and looking at them in the wild. And what they show is the missing link between sugarcane, which is fermented and becomes alcohol in the wild, and soft drinks, and how the animals behave.
This is the sleepy island of St. Kitts in the Caribbean. "300 years ago, velvet monkeys were brought here from West Africa along with slaves serving the rum industry. Escaped monkeys acquired a taste for alcohol by eating fermented sugarcane left in the fields. Today, they satisfy their thirst by raiding local bars. They have learned to be sneaky. Picking the right moment is everything. For years, the monkeys have been studied for insights into our own drinking habits. Just as we vary in our taste for alcohol, so do the monkeys. Some do anything for an alcoholic cocktail. But just as some people are teetotal, so are some monkeys. These reject alcohol in favor of soft drink. Significantly, the percentage of teetotal monkeys matches the non-drinkers in the human population. In line with human habits, most drink in moderation. 12% are steady drinkers, and 5% drink to the last drop. This similarity between us shows that a liking for alcohol is determined mainly by our genes. After each daily raid, other human parallels soon appear. But unlike us, monkeys that are heavy drinkers make better leaders, respected by other monkeys. They seem to tolerate leaders that monkey around. Like monkeys, our taste for alcohol began when we scoured the forest for ripe fermenting fruit.
Crystal Myers was 605.
Food and alcohol became linked with intoxicating effect.
Thanks. So what you can see is that in the wild, sugarcane, alias sugar, ferments, turns to alcohol, and that's the link between sugar and sugar self-administration and many foods and many food compulsivities and addictions, because they share so much common feature. This is particularly the case for a mentor of mine who became the inventor of Gatorade. He had a sports drink and a drink that he could use as an oral replacement for diarrheal and rehydration of usefulness in Africa, in some of the diarrhea dehydration cases, and at the University of Florida, where the football team has to play in 100-degree temperature. But his first, I think it was 2 full versions of the drink, didn't catch on beyond that because they just didn't taste good. And in addition, that taste could make it reinforcing. And so by adding so much sugar to Gatorade, I think he was able to accomplish that. There's also, think about AA and NA meetings where there are local traditions with sugar cookies and baking, and many of the traditions revolve around don't be too hungry, don't be too angry, don't be too lonely, don't be too tired, and all the protections against relapse. But it starts with hunger. And in the old days, we used to take people who were detoxing from heroin and give them sugar cubes and even packs of sugar, to hard candies to carry around with them when they felt craving. So while this work was really exciting for me and Bart Hubble and our students, no one ever referenced it. And in research, you only can tell if a paper is important by the number of citations or the number of times it's referenced. No one really referenced it for 20 years. And I have a review of my 30 years work, and still I don't think anybody for the first 30 years really paid much attention to it until the Yale Historic Conference, where Kelly Brownell and I brought the experts from around the world, some that worked in overeating and liver disease, some that worked in overeating and bariatric surgery, some that worked in overeating and medically assisted treatments, some that worked in psychology and psychological approaches and group approaches. We brought them all together, and Nora gave the keynote, and it helped focus the field on this. In foods, sugar could be added to a food, like it is to yogurt, it is to other drinks, and thereby become the drug of abuse that allows you to have a chemical stimulation of its own taking. So if you think about cigarettes, and back to the analogy with the companies saying it's not addicting, cigarette smoking is to nicotine, the psychoactive ingredient that makes cigarette smoking so addicting, as food is to sugar, with sugar being a key component. So we look at this, you eat something with sugar in it, you crave it, it has addictive properties, blood levels spike, dopamine's released, the brain says do it again, blood sugar levels fall, you have more craving, you have searching for sugar, and this cycle is repeated again and again. And this is part of the reason that we have a global obesity or globesity crisis. And to look at what Pat said, just the all of the tobacco-related savings in healthcare spending have now been replaced by obesity. So again, animals will self-administer sugar. The glucose is self-administered. Fructose corn syrup is self-administered. And we could use this model to develop new pharmacological therapies. The main difference between glucose and fructose was that not that one is self-administered more or less, dopamine is released after both, is that the sugar animals tend to be thinner than the fructose corn syrup animals. So if you just look at soft drinks and say cigarettes are to nicotine as soft drinks are to sugar, look at all of the sugar in these drinks. No person would eat this many sugar cubes, but clearly they do get the same net effect on the brain by drinking these drinks. And there are even self-administration of cocaine, just like it was cocaine, but it's sugar. So this was the message in the New York City anti-obesity commercial. Pretty gross. Because and that's the target's the brain, whether it's sugar or cocaine. Cocaine is clearly much more addicting, but the targeting is very specific. Sugar's been added to everything. You have to look at labels. It's in fruit drink, fruit juice, and there's so many different forms that it's very hard to keep up with. But just caution that this is how fruit drinks become reinforcing. Nicole Lavina's work after Princeton was to go on, and this is a really good summary. She's a great student of Bart Hubble's and mine. This is a wonderful summary in her TED Talk of the whole sugar connection. Well, that's interesting. Let's see if I get that to work. If not.
Picture warm, gooey cookies, crunchy candies, velvety cakes, waffle cones piled high with ice cream. Is your mouth watering? Are you craving dessert? Why? What happens in the brain that makes sugary foods so hard to resist? Sugar is a general term used to describe a class of molecules called carbohydrates, and it's found in a wide variety of food and drink. Just check the labels on sweet products you buy. Glucose, fructose, sucrose, maltose, lactose, dextrose, and starch are all forms of sugar. So are high fructose corn syrup, fruit juice, raw sugar, and honey. And sugar isn't just in candies and desserts. It's also added to tomato sauce, yogurt, dried fruit, flavored waters, or granola bars. Since sugar is everywhere, it's important to understand how it affects the brain. What happens when sugar hits your tongue? And does eating a little bit of sugar make you crave more? You take a bite of cereal. The sugars it contains activate the sweet taste receptors, part of the taste buds on the tongue. These receptors send a signal up to the brainstem, and from there it forks off into many areas of the forebrain, one of which is the cerebral cortex. Different sections of the cerebral cortex process different tastes: bitter, salty, umami, and in our case, sweet. From here, the signal activates the brain's reward system. This reward system is a series of electrical and chemical pathways across several different regions of the brain. It's a complicated network, but it helps answer a single subconscious question. Should I do that again? That warm, fuzzy feeling you get when you taste grandma's chocolate cake? That's your reward system saying, yes. And it's not just activated by food. Socializing, sexual behavior, and drugs are just a few examples of things and experiences that also activate the reward system. But overactivating this reward system kickstarts a series of unfortunate events: loss of control, craving, and increased tolerance to sugar. Let's get back to our bite of cereal. It travels down into your stomach and eventually into your gut. And guess what? There are sugar receptors here too. They're not taste buds, but they do send signals telling your brain that you're full, or that your body should produce more insulin to deal with the extra sugar you're eating. The major currency of our reward system is dopamine, an important chemical or neurotransmitter. There are many dopamine receptors in the forebrain, but they're not evenly distributed. Certain areas contain dense clusters of receptors, and these dopamine hotspots are a part of our reward system. Drugs like alcohol, nicotine, or heroin send dopamine into overdrive, leading some people to constantly seek that high. In other words, to be addicted. Sugar also causes dopamine to be released, though not as violently as drugs. And sugar is rare among dopamine-inducing foods. Broccoli, for example, has no effect, which probably explains why it's so hard to get kids to eat their veggies. Speaking of healthy foods, let's say you're hungry and decide to eat a balanced meal. You do, and dopamine levels spike in the reward system hotspots. But if you eat that same dish many days in a row, dopamine levels will spike less and less, eventually leveling out. That's because when it comes to food, the brain evolved to pay special attention to new or different tastes. Why? 2 reasons. First, to detect food that's gone bad. And second, because the more variety we have in our diet, the more likely we are to get all the nutrients we need. To keep that variety up, we need to be able to recognize a new food, and more importantly, we need to want to keep eating new foods. And that's why the dopamine levels off when a food becomes boring. Now back to that meal. What happens if in place of the healthy, balanced dish, you eat sugar-rich food instead? If you rarely eat sugar, or don't eat much at a time, the effect is similar to that of the balanced meal. But if you eat too much, the dopamine response does not level out. In other words, eating lots of sugar will continue to feel rewarding. In this way, sugar behaves a little bit like a drug. It's one reason people seem to be hooked on sugary foods. So think back to all those different kinds of sugar. Each one is unique, but every time any sugar is consumed, it kickstarts a domino effect in the brain that sparks a rewarding feeling. Too much too often, and things can go into overdrive. So yes, overconsumption of sugar can have addictive effects on the brain. But a wedge of cake once in a while won't hurt you.
So this has been really interesting, the response. So many of the food makers have been upset about this, and we don't mean for anyone to be upset. It's just important for the consumer, especially the consumer that's having some food compulsivity or weight issues, to know how much sugar is in their diet and how much fructose corn syrup and so on, and to understand these interactions. It's also important that for people who are developing new treatments, because clearly eliminating appetite, which is the essence of a survival behavior, is going to be quite different than reducing food reinforcement. We should be able to do the latter a lot easier than the former. Other things that could be done on prevention, this was Kelly Brownell's idea, which is to restrict the amount of exposure to fast food both in utero and in early life. And for us to understand what's in foods that we eat. Now I do this one quickly, but this is a chicken McNuggets and chicken nuggets. Well, you can find that online. The other kind of key work, and again, from Kelly Brownell's group, both Kelly and I helped Ashley get going, but she's now doing great food science at the University of Michigan, where she's working on trigger foods and food preference. And so she's developed the Yale Food Addiction Test. This is available online. You can Google it. It's available in other languages. It's been correlated with functional imaging changes. And just like we have binge eating disorder evaluation for the DSM-5 diagnosis, you can get a Yale Food Addiction yes or no answer from the scales. Which foods are the most addicting and which are the greatest trigger foods? These are both Ashley and Nicole Lavina's work. Chocolate, ice cream, French fries, pizza, cookies is not a big surprise. These are the foods that you would probably think of when you think of foods like that. But way down in the bottom are broccoli. So, you know, if you could add sugar to broccoli, you'd turn this table upside down. So we think food can be addictive, and we do think food addiction is an emerging diagnostic category, and especially sugar being a key element of the addiction process to food, as well as a target for public health initiatives. Other kinds of eating disorders, we have the binge eating disorder. That's, again, very interesting from an addiction point of view because it's treated as if it's a ADHD or psychostimulant treatment. But there's a good and easy diagnostic scheme available now. And Nicole has looked at eating as a modern pleasure, so that food is more than food. It's not subsistence. It's the search for foods to cause pleasure. This is relevant to the problem of body mass index, because if you want to maximize the brain reinforcement produced by food, you would have a different type of food every day. Right? Today you'll have Mexican food, and tomorrow you might have steak, and the next day you might have Italian. The more diversity, the more brain reinforcement, and the more you'll eat. Whereas if you ate the same food, even if it was a highly energy dense food or high sugar food, it was the exact same meal every day, you'd eat less and less and less over time because it becomes boring. And that's a good and useful piece of information if you're trying to manage your food. For gambling and gaming, there have been approaches to treat these with opioid antagonists. So you do almost get the situation where sugar is probably addicting on the basis of dopamine release and brain opioid, naturally occurring opioid effects, and quite the same for gambling, internet, and gaming, where naltrexone is being used and nalmefene is being used. Dopamine is the key molecule. You heard that from Pat. It's in our old textbook as well as in our papers in the 80s. But the dopamine codes the learning, makes the human being pay attention, and does this in a way that makes, hey Jackie, makes treatment very difficult because it's a pathological attachment. Meta-analysis show behavioral treatments have efficacy in internet gaming, especially CBT, for reducing time spent online and reprioritizing social engagements and non-online engagement. There's a comorbidity, just like for addiction, we talk about comorbidities with depression and anxiety disorders. And for behavioral addictions, there are personality traits, OCPD, like the personality of an obsessive compulsive, as well as having obsessive compulsive disorder. But the neural systems of focus are the dopamine systems in whether for gambling or substance or other behavioral addictions, and they're the so-called mesolimbic reward system. I'll end with secondhand effects. An unknown, I have a couple more minutes, just people have not paid very much attention to in utero effects, early developmental childhood effects, and have focused mistakenly on genes at conception. Genes at conception are a very small part. Genes are always changing. They're epigenetic, they're changing in response to environmental exposure. Children of cigarette smoking mothers are born with more nicotine receptors than they would have on the basis of conception. Obese pregnant rats, overfed sugar, produce offspring that are sugar seeking. And by the way, they're also alcohol preferring. So, and our group showed that children in Afghanistan exposed to secondhand smoke of opium had opium in their own bodies and had developmental and other lags, as well as receptor changes. So exposure is very important. And I do think we should keep track of, we want clean air that's tobacco-free and also other drug-free, whether it's crack, opium, or cannabis, as this Jimmy Kimmel demonstrated.
Carelessness and cannabis triggered a house fire in San Diego when firefighters put out.
Whoops, sorry. See if that helps.
Carelessness and cannabis triggered a house fire in San Diego when firefighters put out the flames. They discovered an elaborate pot growing operation there in the garage. Firefighters say some of those marijuana plants did burn, but they also say one person was treated for smoke inhalation.
I inhaled so much smoke.
We've also shown that in animal studies that secondhand smoke is firsthand smoke for the non-smoker causes changes in the brain, euphoria, receptor changes, and drive for eating. And that's in part due to the changes in cannabis, THC, access liberated by smoking. So in summary, we have a polydrug using country with drugs targeting the brain and reinforcement systems. We have events like Pat Carnes described in pornography and sexual compulsivity that target the same system, lotteries, gambling that targets the same system, sugar-like compounds that target the same system. And so we have a primitive brain system that typically was reserved to reinforce just the most specific and important species survival drives now being accessed by TV, the media, internet, and everything else, as well as drugs of abuse. And this really means that we are likely to have more of this polysubstance abuse and more of the consequences that Pat described that are bankrupting the healthcare system and causing so much distress for so many people in the United States. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Gold. We really appreciate you. Thank you so much for a great presentation.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye. All righty, everyone. So I am going to, this is Elsa, by the way. She's my little girl, and my lap dog. So I'm going to copy and paste right now the link to that survey. We've got all of you to fill out to make sure that you get your CE credits for this portion of the conference. So there we go. That should be showing up in the chat bar in the Zoom meeting. Just sent that link to a Google form so you can go and fill that out, and that'll come straight to us, and we will make sure that you're issued your CE certification. All right, so it is that time of day. It is our last conference session. Thank you so much. I see that so many of you have been here all day. We're really, really thankful for your support and hope that this has been really meaningful and educational for you. And so if this is your first time to an Addiction Hope event, welcome. And we're really, really glad that you've joined us for this and that this has been beneficial to you and your practice. So without further ado, I'm going to load the video for our last and final presentation. I'm going to screen share here in one moment. And there we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Addiction Hope Virtual Online opioids and other drugs. We're very honored to have him. Hold on, guys. I'm just pausing this here for a moment because I'm trying to figure out. Here we go. All right. We continue on. And he's joining us from New York City. And I want to read his bio to give you a little bit of background on him, and then he's going to take it right from there into his presentation. So a little bit about Dr. Sederer. He is an adjunct professor at the Columbia School of Public Health, Chief Medical Officer for the New York State Office of Mental Health, which is the nation's largest state mental health agency. And he's a contributing writer for Psychology Today, the New York Journal of Books, and the New York Daily News, among other publications. He has served as Mental Health Commissioner for New York City, Medical Director and Executive Vice President of McLean Hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts, a Harvard Teaching Hospital, and as Director of Clinical Services for the American Psychiatric Association. He's published 12 books and has written hundreds of articles on mental health and addictions for numerous publications. So very, very glad to have him here. And we will turn it over to Dr. Sederer.
Well, it's great to be with you, and I admire so much the work that you're doing from an advocacy and educational point of view. So it's a privilege to be with you.
Absolutely wonderful. So I'm going to bring your PowerPoint up here on the screen so that everyone can see it. And there we go. Oh, we have Mr. Churchill there. All right, there you go. All yours.
So this is the cover slide. It's got my information, but the title is Our Dependence on Opioids and Other Drugs, because it's not just opioids in this country and in other countries. It's psychoactive drugs, drugs that impact our brain, that affect our brain and change the way that we feel and think. That has become an epidemic in this country and other countries. And my approach is that of a public health doctor. I'm a public health doctor, and this talk is going to have three parts. The first part is going to talk about why we're losing the war on drugs, why we're failing to actually reduce the death rate particularly in this country, which continues to escalate from opioid and other drug overdoses. The second part is going to change the focus a little bit and take a look at we human beings, the way that each of us is an active ingredient in our response to a medication or a drug. It's not just the drug, it's the drug and the person. That's the second part of the talk. And the third part of the talk will be solutions, because there are solutions. We need to get to them. They're proven, and I will outline what those are. Go to the first part of the talk, why we're losing the war on drugs. And here, Winston Churchill, I think, summed it up well. You can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. And we continue to try everything else when we actually have increasing proof that everything else doesn't work and that there are solutions. So let me just say what that everything else is, because it continues to be a drumbeat in this country. So next slide, please. So the approaches that have been very popular for a long, long time can be summarized as control, trying to interfere with a person's access to psychoactive drugs, to burn crops, border interdiction, arrest people with undercover agents on the street, et cetera, et cetera. These are control techniques, and they're notoriously ineffective. And then the other approach that continues to be popular is consequences, which is basically scare tactics. And I want to talk about both of those. So from the control point of view, if we can just go to the next slide. This is where we now stand. This is a headline from a satirical newspaper that the drugs have won the drug war. Why have they won the drug war? Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the war on drugs, this is a term that was coined by Richard Nixon when he was president. And it actually had a lot to do with him winning the South by targeting people of color and hippies. But he launched the first major international and national campaign, which was basically arresting people or burning crops or doing border arrests, et cetera, et cetera. That was his war on drugs, and that's what he called it. It didn't work then. Reagan picked up on that and actually redoubled Nixon's efforts with even more North American subterfuge to try to destroy crops and to war with the people who were producing the drugs or distributing it in this country. And wars involve armaments when you think about it. And you might think that this is a photo taken from some Far Eastern country where US forces are invading some insurgent compound. This is actually a photo taken in a small city in the American South. And these are a local SWAT team that is about to make a house arrest on an alleged drug dealer. And look at their armaments. They have massive firepower. They have Humvees. They have these powerful rifles and guns. Where did they get those? Local towns, you can't afford them. But the United States, the federal government has expiration date on all of its armaments. And when their armaments expire, local police can requisition and get all of these for free. And that's what's happening, so that when the war escalates, we have more weapons than the bad guys, the dealers have more weapons, and there's been increasing loss of life, not just of people who are selling drugs, but police have now been shot and killed during these busts. The war on drugs doesn't work. It's never worked. The best example, perhaps, of that is prohibition. Remember that? Prohibition was an effort in this country to illegalize alcohol, and it failed utterly. And it left us, though, with one enduring institution, the mob. which took off during that time, because the more you try to interfere with access to what people want, the more the underground community will satisfy that. That's the war on drugs. Another effect of the war on drugs is the next slide, please. Is the incarceration that has gone on. Over 2 million people in this country in prisons and jails, principally from nonviolent drug offenses. And when you look at the demographics, who are these people in jails, particularly nonviolent criminals? They're people of color. So the war on drugs disproportionately impacts people of color, poor people. That's another consequence. In a way, it's a sort of a hidden form of racism. War on drugs never worked. Next, and then the second strategy, what we just added on, that there has been a resurgence of belief in the war on drugs in the current presidential administration, where they want to marijuana in states with legal maximum sentences, et cetera, et cetera. So this is not an idea that we've outgrown. It's an idea that continues, and it's never been successful. The second strategy is to scare people. And these are posters from before even my time, but probably from the 30s. And these had to do with scaring people about marijuana, about cannabis. The devil's harvest, this is going to destroy your children. And these scare tactics continued and became a school program called the DARE program. You may have heard about that, where schools would invite the police in uniform. Sometimes they would bring a felon with them, and they would try and scare the kids. This is what's going to happen to you if you use drugs. The irony is that the adolescent brain is wired for risk and adventure. Think about it, evolution from an evolutionary point of view. Tens of thousands of years ago, the adolescent, particularly the boy, was needed to leave the home, go forage for new sources of food, find a different mate. So the adolescent brain is drawn towards risk, it's drawn towards adventure. And when we try to scare kids, we put this stuff up, what does it do? It draws them towards what we're trying to scare them about. So control and consequences, control and scare tactics have never worked. Next slide. Okay, so now we're at the second part of the talk. And here, this is moving away from what we continue to do that's not working, to understanding better that there's more going on than the drug, that human beings are active ingredients in how we respond to a substance, whether it's a poppy, cannabis, methamphetamine, doesn't matter, alcohol. And I want to illustrate that with a number of examples of what are the principal drivers of a person's response to drugs, because these are also opportunities for making a difference, for prevention, but there are also ways by which we can better understand and reduce the stigma, because these are persons taking these drugs. These are not drugs taking the drugs. So next slide. Some of your viewers may recognize this lady. And Billie Holiday was one of the best jazz blues singers in this country. And she was born in Baltimore. Her mother was a street prostitute. And she grew up on the streets of Baltimore, essentially, in that kind of awful, violent environment. When she was 10, she was raped. And her screams brought the police. And the police arrested her, thinking that she was a prostitute. And she spent a year in juvenile detention. That was her first criminal conviction. She got out of juvenile detention. Her mother moved to Harlem. She followed her mother to Harlem. Her mother went to work in a brothel in Harlem, in Northern Manhattan. For those people who may not know Harlem, but back then was more or less exclusively the Black community. And she and her mother refused to take her in. So Billy became homeless at about 14, and she had no means of support. She became a prostitute herself. A few years later, she was arrested again, this time for prostitution, not for being raped. And she was sent to Shelter Island, which is a predecessor jail to what we now have as Rikers Island. These are awful places. And she did her sentence there. And the first thing that she wanted to do when she got out of jail was to get as far away from her experience as possible, as far away from rape, from incarceration, from domestic violence, from streets of violence, and to drug use and abuse in her own home. And she first turned to high-potency alcohol and very soon to heroin. And heroin became her partner through the rest of her life. She became a heroin addict, never kicked that habit, and died when she was 43 from complications of alcohol and heroin use. Billie Holiday. This is what we call SET. SET is the internal environment, the psychological predisposition a person brings to their encounter with a drug. And if we could just go to the next slide. And nowadays, we call these adverse childhood experiences. These are the traumatic experiences that children have when they're young, 3, 4, 5, neglect, abuse, domestic violence, foster care, active drug abuse in the home. These are all called adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, and they're additive. That if a child has 3 or 4 or 5 of these, by the time that child is a teenager, they're apt to be addicted to substances, to smoke tobacco, to have early pregnancy, the trouble with the law, mental illness. The trauma produces a psychological set and a biological set, a stress set. But these are called adverse childhood experiences. Or adverse childhood experiences. That's the set. So if we have an internal environment, we have an external environment, and this is called setting, the way in which our social circumstances, our lives, predispose us or protect us from getting dependent on drugs. And this is a photo from about 1971 in Vietnam. These were our soldiers in Vietnam. And at that time, the Department of Defense got wind of the fact that the soldiers in the jungle, combat soldiers, were heavily using heroin. And they became concerned. We had over 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam at the time. And they became concerned that they would bring the heroin habit back to the United States, doubling the heroin using population in the country. So they assigned a drug expert, a doctor named Norman Zinberg, to go to Vietnam and to answer 2 questions. First, what's the prevalence? What kind of use of the soldiers use, and what kind of use of heroin is going on with the soldiers? And the second, if he would predict whether they would bring home their heroin dependence to the United States. And he found that 1 in 5 soldiers were using high-potency heroin, cheap, accessible, 3 to 7 days a week. They were dependent on heroin, 1 in 5. And that's at least 100,000 men at that time. And but he predicted that they wouldn't bring the addiction back to the States at that rate. And he said that's because of their setting, the circumstances in which that they're living. They don't know, they don't know whether they'll be dead or alive by evening. They don't know who the enemy is. They're living in this hot tropical jungle they don't understand, with a war that's unpopular. These were their circumstances, and these are circumstances that one soldier described as wanting to make time go away. That's what heroin did for these soldiers. They didn't bring back the heroin use at 20%, but they did bring it back at 12, which was higher than the general population. But he made his point that social circumstances and what we call now social determinants of health and mental health are powerful drivers in how a person turns to and experiences drugs. Set and setting, interior and exterior. Another really big factor in our response to drugs is age. It's a big difference whether somebody smokes cannabis when they're 12, when they're 20, or when they're 30. And this is a graphic of how our brains mature. Our brains mature by putting this myelin sheath, this sort of fatty protein sheath, around the connections to the nerves. And what that does is enables the brain to communicate better and function better. And the brain is continuously under construction into our 20s. We're myelinating into our 20s, longer for young men than for women. The message here is that exposure to cannabis, which is 60 times more potent than the stuff I smoked when I was in college, is exposing the brain to a mental disorder, family history, or social circumstances. Early exposure of potent substances is a very big risk factor, and it's resulted in families now increasingly messaging to their kids, because cannabis is ubiquitous, to say, hold off for as long as possible, hold off till your brain is better constructed, and then do what you may. Age is a big factor. Next, route of administration is another big factor in how we respond to, human beings respond to drugs. And what do you think the fastest route of administration, maybe I put you on the spot, what do you think the fastest route of administration to the brain of the substance is?
Yeah, it's going to be the bloodstream.
Well, everything has to get to the brain by the blood, but what's the what's the method of administration that you think is the fastest to the brain?
Injection. I would say injection.
Yes, most people think that, and it's completely understandable. But the answer is inhalation.
Ah, interesting.
U is here, and when you think about the anatomy of the body, if you inject into a vein, the substance passes up, goes to one chamber of the heart, to the other chamber of the heart, into the lungs, and then from the lungs up to the brain. It's very fast, but it's not as fast, and the hit is not as powerful as inhalation. And this explains the difference between coca leaves, which are chewed for a lifetime without dependence, crack cocaine, and cocaine, and crack cocaine. Crack cocaine was inhaled, and it became an epidemic. Fastest way to the brain is by inhalation. And some people think that the reason cigarettes are so hard to kick is because of inhalation, because of the rapidity and powerful effect of inhaling nicotine into the brain. Route of administration. Next. So there are a number of other factors. I outline them in my book on addiction, but one of them I want to talk about because you as individuals, you as clinicians, and as citizens may have something to say here, and that's the composition of the plant, particularly cannabis. So cannabis is on the march to legalization, recreational legalization throughout the country. And not that every state will, but I think we're at 8 or 9 states. In DC, recreational, New York State is going to have recreational marijuana. And the marijuana that is grown now is genetically modified, which means that it's bred to be more potent, and that a particular element in the actual plant called CBD. So THC, we know that's tetrahydrocannabinol, that's what gets us high. But CBD, and that's often 60% of the plant, but 20–30% of the naturally grown plants is neuroprotective. It prevents some of the anxiety and psychotic reactions that people, particularly vulnerable teenagers, can have to cannabis. So the CBD is being bred out. You can buy it in some shops, dispensaries, 90%, 100% THC. This is a mistake from a public health point of view, because if youth, particularly, but not youth alone, are going to use THC, then you want to buy stuff that has 20 or 30% CBD. This is called harm reduction. The composition of the plant is another big factor in terms of how we humans respond to substances. Okay, that's the second part. The third part of the talk is about solutions. And as a public health doctor, I've seen and been part of responses to a variety of epidemics. We've seen how we've beaten back some very global epidemics, polio, smallpox. We've seen how there was a groundswell. We got HIV/AIDS under control. We've reduced driving deaths. We've reduced tobacco deaths. These are the ways that a public health approach is effective, and that's not what we're doing now with the opioid and other drug epidemic in this country. And a public health approach starts with prevention, moves to screening, early detection, and then to good intervention. So next slide. So prevention. Prevention is obviously the most successful approach. It's about reducing children, youth going on, putting it off for as long as possible. And there are actually two examples of this that are proven, highly effective, and almost used nowhere. The first is called life skills training, and you can find this online. And it's a curriculum where different for different grades, where children are not scared. They're taught skills. They're taught particularly decision making. So, for example, a kid in 7th grade, friend comes up with a joint, says, hey, it's lunchtime, and the kid is modeled about this and pressured. But a kid who can think through, well, I've got practice at 4 o'clock, I've got a test tomorrow, a kid who can consider his options. This is decision making, and none of us is born with very good decision making. So this is about training kids in decision making and helping them modulate some of their impulses and some of their feelings. This is a proven technique done in schools, but schools have to do it. It's not our mental health community, it's about school breaking. There's a bonding program, Big Brothers, Big Sisters. So if you have an older person in the same background as you who takes you under his or her wing, this is highly protective in terms of kids getting in trouble with the law and substances. Prevention. The other, next slide, please. The other element of prevention is with families. And here's another program that also is a skill-based program for parents. None of us are born skilled parents. I certainly wasn't, and it was my son who had to teach me how, off my approaches were. And it is about positive communication. It's about learning to find what your kids are doing that's good, supporting it in every way. This is a skill-based technique as opposed to being hard or tough on your kids, which drives them away. So prevention works for families, and it's about creating family cohesion. Obama, when he was president, when he was in the White House, he had dinner with his 2 daughters and his wife every evening at 6:30. No texting, no TV. This was about creating the cohesion of the family. Grandma was sometimes there. And it was about prevention and other form of prevention. So these are low-tech interventions that will make a difference for the legion of youth ahead in terms of epidemic, drug epidemic, etc. So prevention. Next slide. Screening is, I'm going to pass over that, but it's no different from doing blood pressure screening or sugar screening in primary care. It's about detecting these problems early and intervening early. But I want to emphasize and have all of us walk through this schematic of the brain. This is a little over. We're encouraging doctors, young doctors, residents, fellows, young doctors, to use when they sit down with someone with an addiction and they sit down with a family of someone with an addiction, because it demonstrates the areas of the opportunities for intervention. So when we start, they look at the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens. These are regions in the brain where we experience pleasure. These are our reward centers. This is where the dopamine hit happens. And it ignites a circuit in the brain. But these are the reward centers. And these are where particular kinds of medications, like Suboxone, I'll come back to that, opioid agonist ones that serve to reduce craving, ones that prevent response. These are the sites where that medication-assisted treatment works. Then another section of the brain, the orbital frontal cortex. This is believed to be the area where our motivation exists. This is about having the experience of, hey, I really like that. I want more of that, where motivation to repeat exists. And we have techniques now, very familiar in the addiction community, called motivational interviewing. And it's hard to understand, but let me, if I can take a moment to give an example. Woman, late 20s, goes into her pediatrician's office with her 6-year-old son, and he has, once again, a recurrent ear infection. And she sits down in the consulting room, and the pediatrician is there, and the pediatrician starts to look at her and says, I know you're a smoker. Don't you know that smoking is associated with ear infections? Don't you know you're making your kids sick? And meanwhile, the mom is squirming in her chair, can't wait to get out and never come back to this pediatrician again. That is not motivational interviewing. That's the opposite of motivational. Motivational interviewing is where the mom comes in and the pediatrician is talking with her and says, tell me some things about your life. Oh, you're a single mom. You have a full-time job. That must be very hard. When you come home, there must be a lot that just sort of falls on you with your child. And the mom says, usually I smoke cigarettes to cope. And the pediatrician says, I can understand that. I can understand how you would want to smoke given your circumstances. And that's when the motivational tipping point is achieved, because then the mom is more apt to say, I know it's not good for me. I know it's not good for my child. And then the pediatrician can ask, what would you like to do about that? That's motivating. Then we have the prefrontal cortex. This is the site of reasoning and judgment, such as it is. And this is the brake. If this is the gas, this is the brake. And this is where, so motivational interviewing is an intervention here. A brake is about enhancing our cortical control over our behaviors. And CBT does that. But support groups, 12-step groups, create the support for people to be able to control their behaviors, prefrontal cortex. And then finally, the amygdala and the hippocampus. These are memory is encoded by what is telling it, what feels strong, like a sight, a sound, a smell, a taste. And with addiction, the principal drivers of relapse are exposure to triggers, like seeing a friend calling who's high, walking past a bar, Prince dies, These are triggers, and the ability to alter triggers is very well accomplished by cognitive behavioral therapy. So we can reduce relapse with relapse prevention groups that particularly are cognitively skill building. So when we're talking with somebody who wants to see to it that their loved one or themselves gets good treatment, comprehensive treatment, this is what we're saying, that just a reliance on NA or just a reliance on medications, that's not enough. But when we add all of these sites of intervention, we get a much more robust response. Someone's much more apt to live, survive, and enter recovery. That's comprehensive treatment. That's what we have to advocate for. It's very hard to get. Two more concepts. These are Latin terms, but they're popular today. A simile, a similibus curantur. That means like cures like. And this is about the peer movement. This was about the start of AA in the early 30s, that a person who's affected with a condition is the person that's apt to help cure that another person with that condition. Similia civilis curantur, and that's in the addiction community and now highly important in the mental health community. The other is spiritus contra spiritum, and this is taken from a letter that Carl Jung wrote to Bill Wilson, one of the co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. And he said that spiritus, that spirituality is necessary to fight spiritum, to fight alcohol, to fight spirits. And that became the other foundation. Peers and spirituality, faith, became the essence of the recovery movement and has continued to this day. And faith plays a very big role in whether, not necessarily organized religion, but faith plays a big role in who recovers. Next. I want to take a moment here because we have now very effective medications. They're not without their problems, but they're the difference between whether people stay alive or die after overdose or when they're in a severely addicted states. The old dog here is methadone back from the 60s, but buprenorphine, Suboxone, that was introduced in 2002. And Suboxone is a very safe drug because it has a ceiling effect. You can't get too high, and you can't depress your respirations so that you have to stop breathing alone. If you mix it with alcohol, pills, and so forth. Yeah. But buprenorphine is the difference between whether somebody enters detox and leaves in withdrawal and goes back and gets a fix, or has something that keeps the craving down and enables them to get into recovery. The other I want to focus on are naloxone, Narcan, which has been used for a long time. It is the antidote to an opioid effect on the body, particularly somebody stopping breathing. And this is used by first responders, but now in many cities, counties, this is being dispensed to families and to friends of people who are addicted because somebody is apt to have a needle in their vein and to pass out and stop breathing. And this is a nasal spray now. It doesn't even require an injection, and it's immediately effective. You need more of it for some of the highly powerful opioids now, like fentanyl. But naloxone, and in New York State, you can buy naloxone at your pharmacy without a prescription. This is a lifesaver. And the other is a medication called Vivitrol, naltrexone, which is a 28-day injection that reduces craving. It made its reputation in alcoholism, but it's got very promising anti-craving effects for opioids as well, because these are antagonists. These act on those areas, the reward centers, these block the reward centers, and these satisfy the rewards. The agonists satisfy the reward centers, the antagonists. So we have this treatment. This is the difference between life and death, and it's hardly being used, medication-assisted treatment. Next. And one more, because people use drugs because they serve them, and not because they're bad or because they're weak. People use drugs because they reduce their physical pain, they reduce their psychic pain. Well, they just transport us away from the everyday grind. So we have to encourage people, and there are many alternatives. But there's one very promising drug that's that I want your viewers to keep an open mind to, and that's a psychedelic, and it's called a psilocybin. And some years ago, it was used to intervene with now 500 people who were facing imminent death, and they were in extreme distress about their dying. And they were given one trip, sometimes two, with psilocybin in a controlled environment. And 80% of these people went from being in terror about their death to being reconciled to their dying, understanding the continuity of life, the universality of life. This is an amazing intervention, and it lasts. It's not just during the drug, it lasts for 6 months, a year afterwards. And we don't have any other intervention, any other treatment where one dose has a persistent effect. And of these 500 people, none of them had bad reactions to the psilocybin, 0. So that's a high safety standard. And so this has led now to research underway. Is psilocybin an effective agent for tobacco addiction, for bad depression, for OCD? We'll find out, and for opioids, psilocybin. So these are alternatives, and it's not addictive. Lastly, next one. This is.
Go ahead. I'm not on the screen. I'm just letting everybody look at your beautiful face. So no worries.
I saw you had reason to pause. So this is about understanding stigma, which is often how a person comes to dislike themselves, hate themselves for their addiction. But as clinicians, as people, as families, we have to watch out for implicit bias, what's called implicit bias. We may say, oh, we understand addiction is a disease, but we don't want any addicts in our office, right? And they're going to cheat us, they're going to try to manipulate us. This is implicit bias, and as if clinicians didn't have addicts in their office, people with addictions in their office. But this is implicit bias, and this is really important because if a person seeking care has a sense that the caregiver or the family thinks no good of them, they're not going to go because they're already ashamed as it is, implicit bias. So lastly, and this is, I think, the shameless slide. Yes, so this is the shameless slide. This is the book. If you like these stories and the history and solutions, all of this is taken, all my talk is taken from this book that came out in May of this year, The Addiction Solution. Scribner is my publisher. And, proud of all that I've learned to try to impart here today.
Wonderful. Well, I just stopped our screens share. Dr. Sutter, thank you so much. So much helpful information there, and we really thank you for being a part of our Addiction Hope online conference and illuminating us. Really, really wonderful to get your wisdom. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And again, my privilege, and keep up the great work. If I can be useful to you, again, don't hesitate.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right, everyone. So I just exited out of our very last presentation. That was Dr. Lloyd Setterer who joined us. So that is it. It has been a really, really wonderful day full of really interesting presentations, and I hope that you all really, really enjoyed it. If you have any comments or questions or things that can help us do this better, please let us know. In the registration email that you received, you got emails for all of us here at Addiction Hope, Jacqueline Eckern, Baxter Eckern, and myself. So please reach out to us and let us know how we can serve you better. And we just want to be able to do that and provide resources in the very best way that we can. So thank you all so much for joining us for our second online conference. We are going to be following up with you for answers to some questions that we got in the chat regarding materials, PowerPoint presentations, and of course, providing you access to these videos post-conference. So look forward to hearing from us. Hope you all have a wonderful day, a wonderful rest of your afternoon, and a great rest of your week. And thank you so much again for joining us on this second annual online conference. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.